The horse was gone. Seraphine had been standing in the same spot for 4 minutes by her count, listening in every direction, and she was now certain Flint was not coming back. She had followed his hoofprints to where the ground hardened into packed roots and needles and surrendered no more marks, and she had called his name twice, in a low voice that was half acknowledgement and half prayer, and the only response had been the Ashwood's particular silence, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that absorbed it. She breathed in and breathed out, and did not swear, because swearing would not help her, and she had promised herself, at the beginning of this journey, that she would remain composed when things went wrong. She had known things would go wrong. That was what plans were for, not to prevent the wrong things from happening, but to give you enough structure that when they did happen, you knew what to do next. She knew what to do next. She started walking north. She had planned this escape the way she planned everything that mattered to her, quietly, over months, without telling anyone. 4 months of careful preparation that had looked from the outside, she hoped, like a princess, spending a great deal of time in the palace library working through old trade records, which was not interesting enough for anyone to investigate closely. She had memorized the route using geographical surveys she found in the back sections of the library, in drawers that had not been touched in 11 years, based on the condition of the dust and the position of the documents inside them. She had sewn enough coin into the lining of her heaviest riding coat to buy passage at the Nevin River crossing and fund 2 weeks of comfortable anonymity on the other side. She had studied the guard rotations on her wing of the palace over 6 weeks, identifying the specific man who had been supplementing his supper with wine from the kitchen stores since winter set in. She had chosen the night of the new moon because it made the corridors darker. She had packed light and planned everything. She had not planned for a snake. It had come out of a pile of dead leaves at a stream crossing, something fat and slow and entirely ordinary, the kind of creature that horses trained for cavalry campaigns and ceremonial parades and border inspections had no business caring about. Flint had cared about it violently. He had gone sideways in one terrible, explosive second and thrown her clean, before vanishing into the trees at a run that said he had no intention of stopping. She had rolled instead of bracing. The one piece of riding wisdom she had absorbed that proved useful in this moment saved her wrist, come up in the cold mud with the breath knocked hard from her chest, and the satchel still across her body by the grace of a well-made buckle. That had been an hour ago, maybe more. She adjusted the strap and walked. The Ashwood pressed in from all sides. She had crossed the border tree line 2 hours before she lost Flint, moving through the gap where the old road entered the forest and the border post stood empty. Empty because nobody wanted to staff a post on the edge of the Ashwood at night, and no local commander wanted to be the one who ordered them to. She had gone through that gap on horseback with her heart moving faster than usual, and her hands steady on the reins, telling herself the forest was just a forest, and the dark was just dark, and the stories she had heard about this place were just stories. She had known, even then, that she was probably wrong. The Ashwood was not the kind of forest you could dismiss once you were inside it. The trees were enormous, not merely old in the way that mature forests grew old, but enormous in the way that changed the scale of everything around them, so that she felt less like a person moving through trees, and more like something very small moving between immovable facts. Root systems rose higher than her waist, and ran for yards before the main trunk appeared. The canopy above was a layered architecture of branches too dense to call open, and the starlight that reached her through the gaps was cold and spare, and gave her just enough to navigate by. The moss covered every surface without exception, every root and rock and fallen trunk, in a seamless green that made the forest look as if it had grown here without interruption, since before the kingdom above it had a name. The sound was wrong. Not absent. She could hear a stream somewhere to the north, and the distant protest of something small in the undergrowth to her left, and the creak of wood settling in the cold. But the sounds were arranged strangely, without the ordinary rhythm of a forest at night. The Ashwood kept its quiet the way a cathedral kept its quiet, as something with specific weight and presence, something that was not the absence of noise but the presence of a quality she did not have an exact word for. She had been trying not to think about what Nora had told her. Nora had been her nurse until she was 13, and her confidant until 2 years ago, when Nora retired to her sister's home in the South, and left the kind of absence behind that a person who fills a large role always leaves. She had held opinions on every subject and had shared them freely across the 20 years of their acquaintance, and her opinions on the Ashwood had been particular. She had said the pack had always been in the Ashwood, not for a long time, not since living memory, but always, as though the pack predated the question of when they had arrived. She had said the Alpha King was nothing like a human king, that he did not have a court but a pack, and that a pack was different from a court because the loyalty moved both directions through it, like water through connected vessels rather than collecting at the top. She had said the forest was aware, not as a metaphor, not as a way of saying it was beautiful and old and worth respecting. As a literal thing she believed, the forest knew who you were and what you carried with you, and had a way of making both of those things relevant before you expected them to be. Seraphine had absorbed all of this as metaphorically true, which was the framework she applied to most of Nora's statements about things that could not be empirically verified, and she had moved on. Standing in the Ashwood in the dark on foot, she was finding the metaphorical framework increasingly inadequate. She walked for 2 hours after losing Flint. The terrain changed as she moved north. The old growth became even older, the trees broader, the roots more complex, the ground beneath them softer with centuries of accumulated matter. There were shapes in the dark that her eyes kept trying to resolve into things she recognized. A flat expanse of stone that might have been cleared with intention. A gap between trees that had the geometry of a passageway someone had made a decision about. She did not stop to examine these. She noted them and kept moving. She was navigating by 2 stars she could see intermittently through the canopy above her. She knew the distance she needed to cover, roughly 8 miles from the tree line to the northern edge of the forest, where the narrow road ran to the river crossing. On horseback, that was perhaps 2 hours. On foot in this terrain it was 4 or 5, but she could still make the crossing before dawn if she did not stop. She stopped, not by decision. Her body stopped the way it sometimes did when her mind had processed something and reached a conclusion before she consciously understood what had been processed. She stood still and breathed carefully, and listened, and looked. The forest was exactly as it had been, except that it was not. The quality of the silence around her had changed, not louder or quieter, changed. As if the space around her had reorganized itself around the presence of something she had not yet identified. She turned slowly to her left. Trees, roots, darkness, nothing unusual. She turned slowly to her right. The same. She looked behind her along the path she had come, back into the deeper dark. She looked forward and up the slope, between the 2 largest pines she had seen yet, and she saw it. The wolf stood between those pines without moving, without making any sound, as if it had always been there, and she had only just arrived at the correct angle to see it. She had known they were large. That was in the historical records she had read during her 4 months of preparation, mentioned in enough separate accounts that she had accepted it as accurate. She had filed it as important, and moved on, because it did not yet have a practical application. Standing 20 feet from one of them in the dark was not the same as knowing they were large. The animal in front of her changed the scale of everything around it. It was nearly as tall at the shoulder as she was. Its body was the length of 2 people laid end to end. Its coat was dark, the color of smoke and old ash, and it absorbed the starlight that filtered down through the canopy rather than reflecting it, as though darkness was something it was made of, rather than something that surrounded it. Only its eyes caught the light and held it. They were gold, not yellow, not amber. Gold in the way certain metals were gold, with depth and age in the color, pale and clear and fixed on her with the complete, undivided attention of something that had been here longer than any road she had ever walked. It was absolutely still. She realized her hand had moved to the knife at her belt without her having made a decision about it. She became aware of her fingers on the handle. She let go. She did not know why she let go, except that some part of her mind had reached a decision faster than her reasoning could follow, and the decision was that reaching for a weapon was the wrong language for this moment. She had not come to the Ashwood with hostile intent. She had come to cross it. She had come running from a palace where her father had explained to her, with patience and the formal kindness that powerful men used when delivering decisions that had already been made, that she was to marry Lord Philip Crane, who was 41 years old, and had buried 2 wives, and whose reputation for coldness was something her father had described as strength of character. She had listened to this explanation with her hands folded and her expression composed, and her mind already running through the calculation of whether she could get out of this. The calculation had taken 4 months, and ended with her in the dark in the ashwood, on foot, talking to the largest wolf she had ever seen. "I am not here to cause any harm," she said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that. "I am crossing your territory on foot, because I lost my horse at a stream crossing, and I could not recover him. I am heading north, and I will be out of the ashwood by dawn. I apologize for entering without asking permission. I was not certain how to ask." The gold eyes did not move. The wolf's ears shifted slightly forward. "I have not set any traps," she said. "I have not cut anything. I have not mapped anything. I am walking north to a river crossing, and I would very much like to continue doing that." The wolf did not respond in any way she had words for. She breathed out slowly and looked at the animal in front of her, and thought about what Nora had said about the forest, knowing what you carried. She thought about what she carried. She carried a satchel with bread and cheese and coin, and a folded map. She carried a bruised shoulder and mud on her coat, and 4 months of careful planning, and the absolute certainty that she was not going back. She carried the name of the man she had found in the margin of a survey book, written in a careful, slightly shaking hand, by a surveyor who had had one encounter with a pack member, and had thought to record the name he was given before he filed his report. She had read that name and kept it, and not told anyone. She said, because she was cold and tired, and her shoulder ached with every step, and there was a point past which absolute composure became its own kind of absurdity. "I do not suppose you would allow me to ride you. I understand that is a completely unreasonable thing to say. You are not a horse, and I am aware of that. But I am still a very long walk from where I need to be." The wolf's head tilted. 1 degree to the left. The gold eyes regarded her. "Forget I said that," she said. She turned and started walking. The sound stopped her. It came from behind her and below her and through the air all at once, at a register that was below what she usually thought of as sound, and above what she thought of as silence. It was not a growl and not a howl. It was something that those 2 words pointed toward without being either of them. It carried intention in it. It carried something she could only call humor, though she did not have a framework for calling it that yet. She turned back slowly. She looked at the wolf. She stood in the cold dark, and she breathed, and she thought about what she had just said, and the sound that had come in response to it, and then she said it again, because the situation was what it was, and she was who she was, and saying it again felt like the most accurate thing she could do. "I wish I had a horse," she said. The sound came again, closer, deeper. It moved through the earth under her feet, and through the cold air around her face, and through her chest, in a way that she felt rather than heard, and it carried in it something that was very old, and very amused. Then the wolf was not a wolf. The shift was rapid, and she filed it under things to think about carefully at a later time, because her mind did not have a framework for what she was seeing, and her mind was a practical instrument that did not process things it had no category for during a moment when she needed to be functional. What stood before her was a man, tall, considerably taller than any man she had met in her father's court, with dark hair, and the kind of build that came from a life spent in actual use of a body, rather than the performance of strength. He wore a dark shirt and plain trousers. His feet were bare on the packed earth of the forest floor, and he seemed entirely indifferent to the cold. His eyes were gold. The same gold, exactly the same, in a face that was human, and a gaze that was something older than the face suggested. He looked at her. He said, in a voice that was low and rough, and completely, impossibly clear, "Then ride me, princess." The ashwood went still. Seraphine did not move for a moment. She stood in the dark, and she breathed, and she looked at the alpha king of the ashwood, who was looking back at her with those gold eyes, and the patience of something that had been here longer than any name on any map. "You know who I am," she said. "I have known your name for 3 years," he said. "The ashwood carries certain things." She considered that. "That should disturb me more than it does." "Probably," he agreed. "I am still going north," she said. "I know. I am not a spy, or a scout, or anyone's advance party. I am a princess, who did not wish to remain in her father's palace. I know that as well." She studied him carefully. His expression was contained in the way that people who were accustomed to authority learned to contain it, not because he had nothing behind it, but because he had learned long ago that showing it all at once was rarely useful. "Are you going to let me leave?" she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. The gold eyes were steady and patient, and told her nothing, except that he had made a decision, and was comfortable with it. No, he said. Not tonight. The cold settled more firmly around her. Then I need an explanation, she said. You will have one, he said. There are things you need to understand before you cross that river. Things that concern both your kingdom and my pack. He looked at her for one more beat. The forest has been waiting for someone from Eldenmore who would come here and speak instead of running. It has been waiting for a long time. She looked at him. She looked at the dark trees and the stars, and the path behind her, and the knife she had let go of. She thought about choices and what it meant to make them freely. She thought about Philip Crane. She picked up her satchel and followed the Alpha King into the trees. He did not walk fast. She had expected him to set a punishing pace, some quiet exercise of control dressed as necessity, something that forced her to work to keep up while he did nothing at all. Instead, he moved through the dark trees at a speed she could match without effort, picking paths around the worst of the root ridges. With the ease of someone who had walked this ground so many times, it required no conscious thought. He did not look back at her. He did not speak. He simply moved, and the trees around him moved slightly too, or seemed to. Branches that should have caught his shoulders angled away from him, with the small, frictionless inevitability of something that understood who it was dealing with. She kept 3 paces behind him and watched carefully. He was tall in a way that the dark forest did not reduce, broad in the shoulders with the particular build of someone whose strength came from the actual use of a body across many years, not from the deliberate cultivation of appearance. He moved almost silently on the packed earth, quieter than she did, and she had been trained to move quietly from the age of 12 by a weapons tutor who regarded noise as a form of carelessness. She was good at it. He was better at it, in the way that a river was better at running than anyone swimming in it. She noticed, after perhaps 10 minutes of walking, that they were not alone. The first movement caught her eye to the left, a shape between 2 trunks that was too large and too deliberate to be anything small, too controlled to be coincidental. She looked to the right without turning her head, and found another. When she angled a glance behind her, the dark between the trees held shapes that breathed. Your people, she said. Yes, he said, without looking back. How many? Enough, he said. She considered pushing the question, and decided it would gain her nothing she could use. She understood what enough meant in this context. She was not planning to run. Running was not going to accomplish anything except exhausting her, and demonstrating poor judgment in a situation that was already working against her. But she liked to know her options, and knowing they were very limited was still information she could work with. She walked and thought. She knew certain things about the pack from the historical records she had spent 4 months quietly studying. She knew their territory was enormous, the entire Ashwood and the upland ground north of it, a region larger than 3 of Eldenmore's midland provinces. She knew they were more organized than the older accounts credited them for being. Those accounts used words like settlement and gathering, when the evidence within them pointed to something considerably more structured. Consistent leadership across generations, internal law that was actually enforced, formal positions with defined roles, trade relationships with certain border communities that had lasted decades. She knew that every agreement the pack had ever made with outside parties they had honored completely, and that the reverse was not always true. She knew the name she had found in a margin note in a survey book 8 months ago, written in a careful, slightly shaken hand by someone who had had one encounter at the tree line and thought to record what they were told. Cale Ashbourne. She had memorized the name and said nothing about it to anyone. She was beginning to understand why the surveyor's hand had been shaken. They walked for roughly an hour. The terrain changed as they moved west and slightly south, still old growth, still enormous trees, but the character of it shifted. The undergrowth between the trunks was cleaner, the ground felt more intentional, shaped by passage over time, rather than simply by the forest's own growth. There were paths here that had been made by many feet, over many years, smooth and clear, running in directions that implied a destination. Then lights appeared, between the trees ahead. Not firelight. The quality was different, steadier, more even, with the warm gold of good oil, in good lanterns, rather than the orange-red flicker of open flame. The lights grew, as they walked toward them, and then the trees opened, and she saw it. She had expected a camp. In her most generous version of expectations, she had expected something that could be called a village, a collection of structures that were more substantial than tents, but that still carried the word settlement in a way that implied impermanence, something that could be moved if necessary, something that had been adapted to its location rather than built for it. Even the most respectful of the historical accounts she had read used words like encampment and den, words that suggested something not quite architecture. What she was looking at was not a camp. The buildings were low but solid, built from stone and timber, with the expertise of people who had been building this way for a long time and had worked out the problems over generations. They were permanent in a way that the word implied something beyond simple construction. They had a settled relationship with the ground they stood on, with the trees around them, with the landscape they were part of. There were perhaps 40 buildings visible from where she stood, ranging from small single-chimney dwellings to 2 larger structures, whose function she could not immediately determine. Between them ran covered walkways and open paths, and the spaces between buildings had the worn, comfortable quality of places that were used daily by people who knew exactly how to use them. There were lights in windows, thin smoke from chimneys, voices at the edges of earshot, the sound of a community at its late evening life. She kept her expression exactly as it had been. She had been keeping her expression neutral in the face of unexpected things since she was 6 years old, and it was, without question, her most reliable skill. Cale stopped at the edge of the settlement and turned to face her. It was the first time he had done so since they had begun walking. His gold eyes caught the settlement's lantern light from behind her and reflected it back. "Ashhold," he said. "It has been here for 200 years. It is considerably larger than I expected," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, something more contained than amusement, and more genuine. "Come," he said, and led her in. People moved through the settlement at this hour, between buildings, between fire pits that had been let down to coals for the night, in and out of doorways with the easy familiarity of people who knew exactly where they were going, and had been going there for years. Every face turned toward her as she passed. She catalogued each one with the practice of someone who had understood since childhood that knowing how people actually felt was more valuable than knowing what they said. Most faces held curiosity, open and genuine, the kind that comes from seeing something genuinely new. Some held caution, a watchfulness that was not hostile but careful. A handful held something harder, a deliberate withholding that communicated itself clearly without needing words. One face in particular, a man standing between 2 buildings, arms loose at his sides, watching her cross the open space. He was perhaps 40, heavy-set in the jaw, with eyes that were almost flat in their watchfulness, not angry in any ordinary sense. Anger had heat in it, and his eyes had none. They were simply closed off, calculating, holding something behind them that was considerably more dangerous than hostility because it was more controlled. He watched her pass without moving and without changing his expression. She filed his face with particular care. Cale led her to a building near the center of the settlement, slightly larger than most of the others, with a fire visible through the front window and 2 people visible near it. Inside the main room, there was a long table and a wide hearth with a good fire, and the 2 people she had seen through the glass, standing rather than sitting, with the quality of people who had been expecting her arrival and had decided to wait for it rather than come out to meet it. The woman was approximately 60, with iron-gray hair pulled back and a stillness in her body that was not the stillness of age, but the stillness of someone who had been still in the face of many significant things over many years and had learned to carry it naturally. Her eyes were amber in the firelight, and she looked at Seraphine the way the best tutor Seraphine had ever had looked at her, with genuine interest and real assessment, not performing anything. The man was younger, perhaps mid-30s, with dark hair that had gone early gray at the temples, and a way of standing that identified him as second in command before any word was said, solidly present, aware of every person and every exit in the room, comfortable in a position that required constant readiness without ever being the center. "Cora is our elder," Cale said. "Owen is my second." "Seraphine of Eldenmore," Cora said, before she had spoken. "You have your father's jaw. Sharper, though." Her tone was not unkind, it was simply precise. "People say that," Seraphine said. Owen looked at Cale. Something moved between them that was not quite a glance, and not quite a question, but carried the characteristics of both. He turned back to her, and something in his posture shifted, a small, but deliberate adjustment that said he had reached a private decision about how to proceed. "You should eat," he said, "and get warm." She sat at the table and ate what was brought, bread and roasted meat and a vegetable preparation that was warm and well seasoned, and considerably better than she had thought to hope for. And she listened while Cale and Cora and Owen talked. Not about her, around her, the way people talked when they had ongoing business that was important, and had decided the new presence at the table did not require them to stop it. She listened to the texture of how they spoke to each other, and learned things that the words themselves did not contain. She learned that Cora's authority sat alongside Cale's rather than under it, that he consulted her in a way that was genuine rather than ceremonial, and that she told him things he did not always want to hear, with the directness of someone who had decided long ago that this was more useful than managing his response to them. She learned that Owen's caution was real but not hostile, the kind of evaluation that took its time, and then trusted completely once it was done. She learned that something had been happening in the pack before she arrived, something ongoing that her arrival had changed the order of, but not the weight of, and that all three of them were aware of this weight, and managing it in their different ways. She did not learn what the thing was. She put it in the column of things she would need to ask directly. After the meal, Cora took her to a room, small and clean, with a wooden shuttered window, and wool blankets on the bed, and pine resin in the air, the way old timber held it. A candle on the table, burning low. A basin with water that was still warm, which meant someone had thought about her arrival before she arrived. "You will be safe in Ashhold," Cora said, standing at the door. "Nothing here will harm you." Seraphine looked at her. "Nothing?" The amber eyes were direct and steady. "Nothing that matters," Cora said, which was a more honest answer than a simpler reassurance would have been, and Seraphine appreciated it for exactly that reason. The door closed. She stood in the middle of the small room and listened to the sounds of the settlement through the walls, voices moving past outside, the creak of the building settling in the cold, someone laughing at a distance, the particular soft rhythm of a community at its late hours. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed and thought through the decision tree she was now inside. She could not leave tonight. She had accepted that clearly, and without argument with herself, because arguing with clear information was not useful. She was in an unfamiliar settlement, in the middle of the Ashwood, surrounded by people who knew this forest in the dark better than she would ever know anything in the dark, and who could run faster in wolf form than any horse she had ever ridden. Attempting to leave would be unsuccessful, and undignified in that order, and she had no interest in either outcome. Tomorrow she would know more. Tomorrow she would know what Cale actually wanted from her, and what she was willing to consider, and what her actual alternatives were. Tomorrow was the terrain she could work in. She changed into the dry clothes from her satchel, and set her knife within reach on the table. She lay down on the bed with the wool blankets pulled up, and looked at the ceiling in the low candlelight, and let her mind settle in the way it knew how to settle when she gave it permission. Not emptying, because that was never quite possible, but finding a quieter arrangement for everything inside it. She was asleep before she expected to be, which surprised her afterward. She woke in the deep middle of the night. No sound had woken her. The settlement was quiet. The candle had burned down to a stub. The room was warm enough. She lay still, and breathed, and waited for her mind to tell her what it had noticed. It was on her left wrist, not pain, something softer than pain and more particular, a warmth that was not the warmth of the blankets, a sensation that moved just beneath the skin, with the deliberate quality of something settling into a place it had found and chosen. She sat up slowly. She turned her wrist toward the last of the candlelight. The mark was there. It was pale, barely more than a slightly deeper tone against her skin, symmetrical, and curved in a shape that was almost lunar, a curve and a crossing, smooth and complete, as though it had always been part of her, and she had only now developed the capacity to see it. She pressed her fingertips to it. The warmth moved under the pressure like something responding. She had checked her wrists that morning when she dressed. She had checked them without thinking about it, the way she checked herself every morning in the glass, and there had been nothing. There was something now. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about Nora's stories and the oldest ones among them, the ones that predated the ordinary kind of story, by enough centuries that they had a different texture, less narrative, more like something recorded, because someone had believed it important to record. Stories about marks that appeared when the world made a decision that the people involved had not yet made themselves. Nora had told those stories with the particular tone of voice she reserved for things she believed deeply, but did not expect anyone to simply accept. Seraphine had accepted them as metaphorically true, which was the framework she applied to most things that could not be empirically verified. She was sitting in a room in Ashhold with a mark on her wrist that had not been there when she went to sleep. She pulled her sleeve down over it. She lay back and looked at the ceiling, and thought carefully about what she knew, and what she did not know, and what the order of operations was for finding out. She kept her sleeve down. She thought about the gold eyes that had known her name for 3 years. She thought about the mark. She thought about what Cale had said in the forest, that the ashwood carried certain things, and she thought about what it might carry and why. The night went on. The dark outside the shutter began, very slowly, to soften toward gray. The settlement began to stir before the light was properly established. A door opening, voices low and practical, the sound of a fire being built up from the night's coals, footsteps on packed earth, with the particular rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going at this hour, because they went there every morning. Seraphine lay in the small clean room in Ashhold and listened to the pack wake up, and she breathed carefully. And she kept her sleeve down over the mark on her wrist, and she waited for morning to give her something she could do. Morning came through the shutter gaps as 4 pale lines, and Seraphine was already dressed when the knock came. One knock, not urgent, Owen's voice through the wood telling her there would be a meeting when she was ready, and that food was available in the main hall. She was ready in under a minute. She ate quickly at the long table, noting the hall in daylight, larger than the candlelight version of last night, with the lived-in warmth of a space that was genuinely used rather than arranged for impression. 8 people were eating, most of whom looked at her with the same quiet curiosity she had catalogued the night before. 2 did not look at her at all, which was its own statement. The man with the flat eyes was not at breakfast. She noted his absence and what it might mean and filed both. Owen led her to a smaller room off the main building, a proper meeting room, with a rectangular table and chairs and the fireplace already lit against the morning cold. Cale was already there, seated at the head of the table, with a cup of something hot in his hands, and the gold eyes resting on her arrival, with the particular quality of someone who had been thinking about this conversation since before she was awake. Cora sat beside him, her hands folded, her amber eyes doing the same direct assessment they had done the night before. 2 people she had not yet been introduced to sat further along the table. The man with the flat eyes sat at the far end. He had positioned himself where he could watch her enter. She sat in the chair Owen indicated, directly across from Cale, and she folded her own hands and waited. Cale did not open with pleasantries, which she was glad of. She had attended enough formal council meetings in the gallery above her father's chamber to know that pleasantries in the opening of a serious discussion were usually a way of establishing hierarchy rather than setting a comfortable tone, and she did not have the patience for hierarchy establishment today. The Ashwood shares a border with Eldenmore, along 43 miles of the western river edge, he said. The treaty discontinued 42 years ago, by your kingdom, established terms under which our people used the river crossings and the border grazing land. We have continued to observe those terms in practice, because the alternative was open conflict, which we did not want. Eldenmore has behaved as though the treaty never existed, because that was the more convenient position for them. He set his cup down. What I need, he said, is a formal emissary from Eldenmore, not a messenger. Someone with authority to conduct negotiations, and to make commitments that will be honored. Seraphine said, I am 19 years old. I occupy a formal position in my father's household, with no attached authority over anything, political or military or trade-related. I was given a room in the East Wing and told to prepare myself for a marriage my father had arranged. That is the full extent of my official standing. I know your standing, he said. Then you know I cannot be what you are describing. You cannot be that today, he said. You can be the person who makes it necessary for someone appropriate to be sent. A letter from you with your seal is not ignorable in the way that a letter from a pack elder is ignored. You are the king's daughter. Your word delivered in person creates an obligation that your father cannot simply set aside. She looked at him steadily. You want me to be leverage. I want you to be an emissary, he said. An emissary speaks for both sides. Leverage only pushes in one direction. The difference, she said, is easier to articulate than to maintain, when the two positions have interests that are not aligned. Yes, he said, it is. That is why I am not asking you to maintain it alone. I am asking you to begin a process. The man at the far end of the table said, she cannot be trusted. He said it the way someone stated a fact they did not consider worth debating. She looked at him directly. You are the man who watched me cross the settlement last night, she said. Not with curiosity, with something colder than that. He did not react to this in any way that said she had touched anything. Gareth speaks for a part of the council, Cora said, from her place beside Cale, with the precision of someone managing a room that required management. His concerns are formally noted. My concerns are not complicated, Gareth said, still looking at Seraphine. Your kingdom made a formal agreement with this pack. They honored it when it was useful and abandoned it the moment it became inconvenient. Now they have something they want returned, and they will agree to whatever terms are offered to get it back, and then they will find reasons not to honor those terms once the something is returned. This is not speculation, this is pattern recognition. Seraphine said, the history you are describing is accurate. He looked at her. The flat eyes shifted slightly, adjusting to this response. It does not follow, she said, that the future repeats the pattern identically, particularly if the person conducting the engagement is not the same king who conducted the original abandonment, and particularly if there is an independent reason to take the agreement seriously that goes beyond political convenience. She held his gaze. I am not here as my father's representative. I walked out of my father's palace in the middle of the night and crossed the Ashwood on foot after losing my horse to a snake. That is not the behavior of someone who was sent. Gareth was quiet. What you observed, she continued, is pattern. What I am offering is information that is different from the pattern. You are right to note the difference as insufficient on its own, but it is still a difference. He said nothing to that. She had the impression he was filing it rather than dismissing it, which was something. Cale had been watching this exchange without intervening. She glanced at him and found his expression contained in a way that she was beginning to understand was deliberate, not showing preference openly, waiting to see what the conversation produced. She turned back to the table. What I can offer, she said to the room, is honesty. I can tell you what I know about how my father makes decisions, and what arguments reach him, and what arguments do not. I can tell you what commitments from him are likely to hold, and what ones are not, based on 12 years of observing his governing in detail. I cannot guarantee outcomes, and I will not pretend I can. I have no formal authority, and I will not perform one. That, Cora said quietly, is more useful than anything Eldenmore has offered this pack in 4 decades. The meeting continued for another hour. Cale asked questions, and she answered them. Gareth asked questions that were less questions than tests, looking for places where her story did not hold together, and she answered those too. Not defensively, because defensiveness would have been the wrong signal, but carefully, with the precision of someone who was not making anything up and therefore did not need to be careful about which version she told. She learned things from what they asked. She learned that the pack had been tracking the border river water quality for 4 years, which was careful and methodical, and told her something about how seriously they were taking it. She learned that 3 attempts had been made through informal channels to raise the issue with Eldenmore's trade offices, and that all 3 had produced no response. And she learned, quietly but with some impact, that the person who had made those 3 attempts was Gareth. He had tried to make contact, 3 times through proper channels and received nothing. That was the kind of thing that hardened a position into something colder than simple opposition. She filed it and said nothing about it yet. Midway through the meeting, Cale reached across the table for a document, and his sleeve pulled back at the wrist. She had only a second to see it before the sleeve came back down, but she had seen enough. The same mark, the same pale curved lines on the inside of the left wrist. Not identical in its exact tracing to what she had on her own wrist, but unmistakably the same in kind. He looked up. His gold eyes met hers across the table. He had noticed her noticing. Neither of them said anything. The meeting continued. She kept her own sleeve exactly where it had been, and her expression exactly as it had been, and she thought about the mark on her wrist, and the mark on his wrist, and what Nora had said about bonds, that the world made for its own reasons. independent of what the people involved had planned. When the meeting ended, she was told, by Owen, that she could move through Ashhold freely during the day, not beyond the settlement perimeter. She thanked him for telling her that directly, rather than simply restricting her movement without explanation, which was what most people in authority did, and his expression shifted slightly, in a way that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. She was sitting on a low step outside the main building, letting the cold morning air work through her thinking, when someone sat down beside her. She had not heard her coming, which was impressively quiet. The girl was perhaps a year younger than Seraphine, perhaps 18, with a direct gaze and the particular frankness of someone who said what she thought, before she had fully decided whether to say it. She had dark eyes, and wore her hair in a practical braid, and sat on the step, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who sat on steps whenever she felt like it. "I am Lydia," she said. "I know who you are. The whole settlement has known since before sunrise." "That seems inevitable," Seraphine said. "Gareth is saying you are here to report back to your father about our defenses," Lydia said, without particular judgment in her tone, just as information sharing. "He has a faction, about 6 people who think the way he thinks. What do you think?" Lydia looked at her sideways. "I think if you were here to report on our defenses, you would have tried harder to leave last night, instead of sleeping in the room we gave you." She paused. "I also think you are not frightened, which is either very good judgment or very poor judgment, depending on what you are dealing with." "I hope it is the former," Seraphine said. "Can I show you something?" Lydia said. She led her to the north edge of the settlement, to a space between 2 buildings that had been arranged around a flat stone set into the ground. The stone was old and smooth, and had been maintained. She could tell it had been tended because it was free of moss, in a place where everything else was covered in it. Cut into the stone were names, arranged in careful rows, each one accompanied by dates below it. 31 names. The dates were all clustered within a span of 3 months, 20 years ago. At the bottom of the stone, set apart from the rest with more space between them and the rows above, were 11 names, smaller letters, the same careful hand that had cut the others. The dates beside those 11 names were shorter, the years between birth and death compressed down to almost nothing. Seraphine read every name. She stood in front of the stone in the morning cold, and she read all 31 names, and she kept her face composed, because that was what the moment deserved, not visible emotion, which would have been for her benefit rather than theirs, but the quiet acknowledgement of full attention. "The silver plague," Lydia said quietly. "It came through the eastern streams. 3 months in the summer, 20 years ago. 31 people. 11 of them were children." She paused, and then, "The Alpha's mother is on the list. She survived, but she could not shift again after that season." The silver damage went too deep into her. "He was 15, Seraphine said, not quite asking. 15, Lydia confirmed. "He watched it happen." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "What did the water testing show at the time?" she asked. "Silver compounds in the eastern stream system. Elevated, well past what natural ground deposits would produce. We could not determine the source conclusively. The border rivers all tested contaminated, but nothing above them was accessible to us to test." Seraphine was very still. She was thinking about a council meeting she had attended 2 years ago. The formal gallery above the chamber, where women of the royal household sat when they were permitted to observe, which was infrequently and unofficially. A trade committee report. Section 11 of the report. Agricultural development in the northern farmlands. Implementation of a new soil treatment compound that had significantly improved yields in the rocky northern terrain over the past decade. She had read the chemical summary in the appendix. She remembered reading it because she read everything she was given access to with the same attention, and because one of the compounds listed had struck her as notable at the time. It had contained trace silver, in concentrations that were individually small but that, applied across thousands of acres of northern farmland and washed by rain into the river systems feeding south, would build over years into something considerably less small. "The Northern Eldenmore Farms," she said. "The large-scale agricultural program that expanded approximately 25 years ago. They use a soil treatment compound that contains trace silver elements. The runoff from those farms feeds into the northern river system, which feeds your eastern border streams." She looked at the stone. "The concentrations build slowly. 2-3 years of accumulation before levels reach harmful range. If the program expanded heavily 26 years ago. 26 years before the plague, Lydia said. Her voice had gone very quiet. This was not deliberate, Seraphine said. I want to be clear about that, because I know it matters. The people making agricultural policy in Eldenmore were not thinking about the border rivers. They were thinking about grain yields in the north. They never looked at the connection. She looked at Lydia directly. That is not an excuse. It is the specific shape of the problem. And it matters because a specific problem can be specifically addressed. Lydia was looking at her with an expression that was neither the suspicion she had been half expecting, nor the relief she had not been expecting. It was something more complicated than both. Kale has 4 years of water quality records, Lydia said carefully. The levels are rising again. Not to what they were 20 years ago, but climbing, Seraphine said. Yes. I need to see those records. She walked beside Lydia through the settlement, and she noticed things as she walked, because noticing was the habit she could not suspend. The paths between buildings well-worn and practical. The gathering space that would have been central in any settlement, used and maintained. People moving through the late afternoon with a purpose she was coming to understand was just what ordinary life looked like in a community that knew who it was. She noticed all of it, and she filed it. The settlement that had produced 31 dead and 11 children among them 20 years ago was still standing, and still occupied, and still moving forward with this particular quality of purposeful continuity, and that was its own kind of statement about what people were capable of when they decided what to do with loss. She noticed also that nobody had asked her to leave. Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and turned toward the settlement, and Seraphine followed her, and they both walked away from the stone and the 31 names and the 11 smaller ones at the bottom. And Seraphine kept her sleeve down over the mark on her wrist and thought about what she needed to build and how to build it, and how much time she had to do it before the water in the eastern streams climbed to the level of 20 years ago, and 31 became a larger number. The water records were kept in a flat wooden box, in a back corner of the settlement storage room, tucked behind stacks of grain sacks and folded canvas, and the particular ordinariness of the location told Seraphine something she considered carefully before she said anything about it. The pack had been gathering this data with methodical consistency over 4 years. They had dated each entry, noted the location, maintained the same measurement format across 2 different people's handwriting. They had been treating it with the seriousness of people who understood they were tracking something real. What the location said was that they had not yet understood the specific gravity of what they were holding. That was about to change. Lydia carried the box for her to the room with the west-facing window that had been Seraphine's workspace for the past several days. She set it on the table and sat in the doorway with the easy patience of someone who had nowhere to be and was content to wait. Seraphine opened the box. 4 years of records. The first 2 years were written in a hand she did not know. Careful. Even letters that spoke of someone who took legibility seriously. The last 2 years were in a second hand, slightly more angular, the writing of someone who was writing quickly but consistently. Both hands had maintained the same notation format: date, position along the stream network, a brief description of the water's appearance and smell, and then the measurement itself. The measurements were written in the same units throughout, which meant the format had been designed before the data collection started. Someone had thought this through before the first sample was taken. She read everything twice. The first time she was building the picture. The second time she was checking it. Both times the picture was the same. Year 1. Elevated silver concentrations in the border stream samples, higher than what natural ground deposits would produce in this kind of terrain, but still in a range that would cause no immediate symptoms in most people. Year 2. The numbers had climbed. Not dramatically. This was not a spike, not an event. Just a steady measured increase, the kind that happened when a continuous source kept adding, and the water could not clear it quickly enough. Year 3. Higher still. The entries from 10 weeks ago, the most recent data in the box, showed numbers that she read twice, and then sat quietly with, for a moment. She did the calculation in her head. She ran it again to verify. At the current rate of increase, the border streams would reach the concentration levels of 20 years ago, in approximately 2 years. If rainfall increased the runoff from the northern farms, it could be faster. She closed the box and went to find Kale. Owen directed her to the working building on the western edge of the settlement, without apparent surprise at the question. She had been navigating Ashhold freely for nearly 2 weeks now, and the pack had largely stopped tracking her movement. which she appreciated as a kind of practical trust, even if it had not been offered explicitly as one. The working building was long and low, with workbenches along both walls, and tools hung from pegs in careful organization. It smelled of worked wood and metal shavings, and something she could not name, that lived in places where people made things over many years. Cale was at one of the benches near the back, working on something with his hands, and he looked up when she entered with the unhurried quality of someone who had expected to see her at some point in the morning, but had not fixed the time in his head. She sat on the stool across from him and placed the box on the bench beside her and began. She told him about the trade committee report first. She told him what session it had been, how long ago, the specific section number in the document where the agricultural compound information appeared. She told him she had been in the formal gallery above the council chamber, which was where women of the royal household were permitted to attend when the invitation was extended, which happened irregularly and unofficially. She told him she had been attending those sessions since she was 15 and had read everything her father's council produced that she could get access to, not because she was required to, but because she had found early on that understanding how decisions were made was more useful than simply living with the decisions. Then she told him about the compound, its chemical composition, the trace silver elements in the soil amendment that the northern Eldenmore farms had been using heavily since they expanded the agricultural program 26 years ago. The way the compound washed into the northern river system when it rained, carried south, feeding into the border rivers, feeding into the PAC's eastern streams, the rate at which trace concentrations accumulated in a water system over years, the timeline that resulted when you mapped the heavy program expansion 26 years ago against the 3-month plague season 20 years ago. She told him what the records in the box showed for the current situation. She laid each piece down in sequence, methodically, without additional emphasis, because the information was persuasive enough on its own, if presented clearly, and adding emotion to it, would give anyone who reviewed it permission to treat it as advocacy, rather than evidence. She had sat in enough formal councils to know how decision-makers handled emotional arguments versus factual ones, and she was not going to make the mistake of blurring the two when the facts were this clear. When she finished, the room was quiet. Cale was looking at the box without speaking. She watched his face and saw the thing that lived behind his controlled expression shift slightly, the way a current shifted underwater that looked still from the surface. "You read this in a council report," he said. "2 years ago," she said. "In the gallery above the chamber. My father does not know how closely I follow those proceedings. He thinks I attend because it gives me something to do." She said it without heat, because there was no heat left in it. She had spent years past the point of being angry about how she was underestimated. Now it was simply a condition she had learned to make useful. He has been wrong about that for 7 years, and he does not know he is wrong, which has occasionally worked in my favor. "We sent 3 messages to Eldenmore," he said, "about the water, over 4 years. Border trade correspondence goes to a reviewing secretary before it reaches anyone with authority to act on it," she said. "A message about water quality from a party Eldenmore does not officially recognize as a diplomatic body would be filed under environmental correspondence and reviewed at the next quarterly standing committee meeting. The people at that meeting have no reason to connect it to anything in the agricultural licensing division because those departments do not share information. The connection does not exist for anyone at that level, unless they already know to look for it." She met his eyes. What you needed was someone inside the palace, who already had both pieces of information and understood what they meant together. "We did not have that," he said. "You have it now," she said. "The question is what we do with it." He was quiet again. She had learned by now that his quiet was not the absence of thought, but thought in a form that did not produce noise. She let it run. "Build the document," he said eventually. "Everything you need to make this inarguable." "I am building it," she said. "I need the original compound registration records from the capital. I sent for them through Adrian. When they arrive, I can complete the evidentiary chain." He nodded, and she picked up the box and went back to the west window room. She spent the remainder of that day working, and the next, and the ones after. Lydia found her paper and proper ink from somewhere in the settlement stores. Seraphine organized her argument the way she organized every argument she had ever needed to make. Start with the question, build the evidence base, show the logical steps, reach the conclusion. Make the conclusion harder to avoid than to accept. She kept the language precise and the emotional content absent, and the sourcing explicit at every point, because a document that could not be argued away was more powerful than one that was merely persuasive. She moved through the PAC's daily life as she worked, partly because staying in the room all day would have told the settlement she was withdrawing, and she was not withdrawing, and partly because the settlement was genuinely interesting, and she learned things from being in it that she could not have learned from sitting alone. She learned the daily rhythms, the morning wood carrying, which was a communal task involving whoever was available, and which she joined on the second day, and continued to join without comment being made about it. The midday meal, which was the largest of the day, and involved the largest gathering. The afternoon work hours, which were quiet and purposeful, and had the feel of a community that understood what it was doing and why. The evenings, which were the most social part of the day, and which she spent differently depending on who was available and what seemed useful. She helped where helping was natural. She sat with Iris the healer for a long afternoon, and asked questions about what healing work involved, and Iris answered them with the precise economy of someone who did not use more words than a question required. Seraphine learned things in that afternoon that she filed carefully, because they were directly relevant to the evidentiary document she was building. The specific symptoms of silver toxicity, the progression of the plague season as the healer who had treated it had described it to Iris, the treatments that had worked, and the ones that had not. She practiced with her knife every morning in the courtyard between the storage buildings. Brennan appeared on the third morning. He was perhaps 50, gray-bearded, with hands that had worked hard across many years, and showed it. He had been in the settlement's background since she arrived, present, watching, making his own evaluation. On the third morning he walked to the practice blade rack on the storage building wall and took one down and said nothing. She said yes. He was faster. He was stronger. He did not make allowances for either. She lasted 4 exchanges the first morning before he had her weapon on the ground, and her arm extended at an angle she had not been trained to expect. She picked up the blade. 6 exchanges the next morning. 8 the morning after. He did not comment on the improvement, but he came back each morning, which was comment enough. Somewhere across the following week, the courtyard practice stopped being private. 3 younger pack members began appearing at the edge of the space. Watching from a distance they maintained, with the consideration of people who had decided they were an audience rather than participants. She acknowledged them by doing the work well, and otherwise ignored them. She learned the pack's relationship to its own history in the evenings at the communal meal, not from formal accounts, but from the way the older members spoke about particular times and particular people in the course of ordinary conversation. She had trained herself years ago to listen, as if she were not listening. In her father's palace, this habit had produced intelligence about court politics. Here it produced something she valued differently, an understanding of what this community had been through, and what it had decided about itself because of those things. The silver plague was present in conversation, the way things were present, that formed part of a community's permanent foundation, not as a wound still open, but as a fact that explained other facts. The water records, the border caution. The specific quality of Gareth's hesitation, which made more sense to her now than it had in the first council session. She thought about what it meant to carry a loss of that scale and build a life on the other side of it that was still fully and recognizably itself. Gareth and his 6 remained at their consistent remove. She had expected this to feel hostile, and it did not, precisely. It felt like something more like a held breath. People who had made a decision and were watching to see if the decision held up. She did not approach them. She built her document and moved through the settlement and let the held breath hold. Lydia sat with her most evenings, frank and direct, and occasionally quite funny, in the particular dry way of someone who had a clear eye for the absurdity in situations that everyone else was taking too seriously. Through those evening conversations, Seraphine assembled a picture of the settlement's social reality that was considerably more nuanced than what formal observation would have given her. She learned who the real influence holders were, and the difference between that and who appeared to hold influence. She learned the history of Gareth's 3 failed messages in detail, not just the fact of them, which she had heard in the first meeting, but the specific content of what he had written, and the timing, and what he had hoped for in response, which had been not very much, and which had not arrived. On the 11th evening, Cale found her at the window. He sat across from her in the amber light of the late afternoon without announcing himself, which had become a thing that happened in the evenings now, the alpha of the pack appearing at the doorway of the west window room and sitting in the chair across from her and talking, or not talking, in a way that had taken on its own particular quality across the days of it. He asked what she thought of Ashhold. She gave it a real answer, the kind that required a real moment before it came. She told him it was more than she had been prepared for. She told him the accounts she had read had failed it, in the way accounts always failed things that could not be understood from outside them. He asked what word she would use, and she thought about it genuinely for a moment, looking at the window, and the amber light beyond it, and the settlement she could hear but not see. Complete, she said. It exists entirely on its own terms. It does not need anything from outside itself to continue being what it is. Most places do need something from somewhere else. This one does not. She paused. That is different from not needing acknowledgement from the outside. Acknowledgement is a different kind of need. Yes, he said, it is. Your water problem cannot be solved from inside the forest, she said. The source is outside the tree line, and the response has to come from outside the tree line. That is why you need someone on the outside willing to push. She looked at the document on the table. I understand what it costs to need something from people who have decided you do not officially exist. I have been thinking about that a great deal over the past 2 weeks. He was quiet. The amber light was going deeper, the afternoon pulling toward evening, and the sounds outside the window were shifting from the sounds of work to the sounds of a community, moving into its later hours. The document, he said eventually. How long? Another week, once the records arrive, she said. When I have the original compound registration, the chain is complete. She picked up her pen. Then I will know whether my father is capable of doing the right thing, or whether I will need to make it the only available thing. He stood. He looked at her work spread across the table, with the look of someone recognizing a form of work they did not do, but understood as serious. Come inside before dark, he said, and left. She worked until the candle Lydia brought her was half burned down. Owen came before dawn. She heard his footsteps in the corridor 20 seconds before the knock, fast, deliberate. The pace of someone who was not running but had made a decision about urgency. She had been awake for the past hour, in the particular light sleeping way that came from knowing something was going to happen, before you knew what it was. And she was already sitting up when the knock landed. She opened the door. Owen's face told her before his words did. She had spent 12 days learning Owen's face, and she had learned that it was a precise instrument for those who paid enough attention to it. 500 Eldenmore soldiers, he said. Northern tree line. The watch found them at midnight. She processed that for exactly 2 seconds. General Adrian, she said. He paused very briefly. You know him. My father's second military advisor. He would be the one sent for a situation with unknown variables and potential diplomatic complexity. She was already pulling on her boots, moving with the economy of someone who had decided on action before she had all the information. What formation are they in? Holding at the tree line, Owen said. Not advancing. Not in attack position. Good. That is Adrian's protocol for a situation where he does not yet know if he is dealing with a diplomatic event or a military one. He is cautious, and he is professional, and he does not like to make commitments that he cannot reverse. She stood and picked up her coat. Who else knows? The whole settlement, by now. The watch told the overnight people, and it ran through the pack before morning. She followed him through the corridor and into the main building. The meeting already underway when she pushed through the door held a charge in it that had not been in any of the previous meetings. The room was fuller than usual, not just the council members but Brennan, standing against the back wall with his arms crossed and his white-bearded face very still, and 2 of the younger men she knew from the courtyard practice mornings, and Marta, an older woman whose name she had learned, but who she had never heard speak in a formal meeting before. Gareth was at his usual place at the far end of the table. For the first time since she had arrived, he was not watching her. He was watching Cale. Cale was standing at the head of the table. The kind of stillness he was maintaining was the kind she had learned to distinguish. Not patience, but the controlled form of something that would have been quite different without the control. 500, Cora said, when Seraphine entered, and said it to Cale, but aimed her amber eyes at Seraphine. Standard deployment for a situation with unknown hostile variables and political dimensions that require caution, Seraphine said, stepping into the room and keeping her voice level and informational. My father would not authorize more than that. without confirmation of an actual threat. General Adrian is a careful man who follows protocol, and his protocol in this situation is to create visible presence without creating a commitment. He is not here to start a war. He is here because my father needs to know whether I am alive, and because 500 soldiers at the tree line is a fact that cannot be ignored. And if they are not answered, one of the young men said. Adrian documents and sends a full report back to the capital, and waits for authorization before taking any further action. He does not decide to start a war on his own authority. That is both his training and his personal disposition. She looked around the table and then at Kale. If someone meets him at the tree line as a recognized representative and conducts a formal exchange, he will conduct himself formally in return. He has been trained for this kind of encounter. The room was looking at her. She felt the weight of it and met it evenly. She looked at Kale. Let me go out to meet him, she said, as emissary. This is exactly what you said you wanted 2 weeks ago. Let me do it. Owen said, without hostility, but with the directness that was his particular quality. You arrived here with no formal standing. I arrived here as a person making a personal choice, she said. I have always had formal standing. I have simply not been exercising it, because there was not yet a context in which exercising it would be useful. She did not look away from Kale. There is now. She is right, Cora said, in the tone that ended discussions. Kale was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the room adjusted its breathing around the silence, which was a thing she had observed happening in meetings when the person at the head of the table was working through something real, rather than performing thought. Go as yourself, he said finally. What you tell him is your own choice. I understand, she said. They brought her a gray mare from the pack's small stable. She was a different kind of animal from Flint, shorter, more compact, with a steady quality that suggested she had been trained by someone patient. Seraphine mounted and rode through the settlement in the pale early morning, through the northern passage and into the Ashwoods corridor, where the trees grew slightly younger and the path ran clear toward the northern tree line. 2 pack members rode at a distance she did not acknowledge, and they did not make conspicuous, which was the correct approach for exactly this kind of situation, and she was glad to observe that they understood it. She used the 40 minutes to prepare what she was going to say. She built the argument in full, and then reduced it to essential points, because essential points were what someone under visible pressure could deliver with clean authority, and she was going to be under visible pressure when she came out of those trees in front of 500 soldiers. The trees thinned and then broke. She came out into the open ground. 500 soldiers in Eldenmore gray. The formation spread wide along the tree line, 200 yards to the east, holding position in the way that a professionally maintained hold looked. Settled, ordered, alert without being aggressive. Not an attacking formation. Exactly what she had told the meeting it would be. At the center, on a bay horse, General Adrian sat with his adjutant beside him, and his attention trained on the tree line, and when she came out of the trees, he looked at her for 3 full seconds with the focused, deliberate stillness of someone who was making absolutely certain they were seeing what they appeared to be seeing before they reacted to it. She rode toward him at a measured pace, straight-backed, hands visible, face composed. She had been performing composure since childhood, and she performed it well, and today composure was not even a performance. She was actually calm, because she had prepared for this, and preparation was the specific antidote to the kind of anxiety that came from not knowing what you were walking into. She prepared what she would say on the 40-minute ride through the Ashwood corridor, working through it the way she worked through any formal presentation. Identify the core asks, build the argument for each, anticipate the objections, prepare responses that acknowledge the objections, rather than ignoring them. She did this with the same focused attention she would have brought to a formal council memo, riding through the pale morning with 2 pack members, at a distance she did not acknowledge, and they did not make conspicuous, which was the correct protocol for an escort that was present without being a display. She was ready when the trees broke. He rode forward to meet her, with 2 soldiers flanking him at the regulation distance, which was the correct formal response, and she observed with appreciation that he had chosen the formal response over any of the less formal alternatives available to him. It told her that he had read this situation as diplomatically sensitive and was treating it accordingly, which was exactly what she had told the meeting he would do. Your Royal Highness, he said, when they were close enough that speaking at conversational volume was appropriate. His voice had the precise control of someone trained in formal address. "General," she said, "I trust the journey north was not too difficult." "We had," he said carefully, "been informed you were being held against your will." "The information was incorrect," she said, maintaining the same conversational tone, as though they were meeting at a border inspection, rather than in a field, with 500 soldiers between them and the tree line. "I entered the Ashwood by my own choice. I remain here by my own choice, and I have been treated with complete hospitality throughout. I am here today as an emissary in a formal diplomatic capacity." She watched his professional face receive this and process it. "I need several things from you, General. First, stand your formation down from the current holding posture to a genuine non-threatening position. No visible weapons. Full distance from the tree line. Any contact with the tree line runs through me. Second, do not engage with any pack members who appear at the tree edge. Third, send a rider today to the Capital Trade Licensing Office for the original registration and composition documents for the agricultural compound program implemented on the northern farmlands. All years of record, from the program's beginning. I need those documents here within 7 days." He studied her for a moment. She let him. "Your father," he said, "will require confirmation of your well-being and the voluntary nature of your presence here. I will write him a letter this morning," she said. "You may carry it yourself and verify my hand and my seal with your own eyes before it leaves your possession." He was quiet for another moment, working through the variables of this with the thoroughness she had expected from him. He was not a man who was easily thrown. He was a man who recalibrated efficiently when conditions changed. "The agricultural compound documents," he said. "May I ask their relevance to the current situation?" "They are evidence in a formal matter that is integral to the diplomatic discussions currently underway," she said. "I need them to present a case that is in Eldenmore's direct interest, to have presented accurately." He held her gaze for another moment. "I will send a rider today," he said. "I will request authorization from the capital to maintain holding position for 7 days, pending the outcome of your communications." "Thank you, General," she said. Adrian was quiet for several seconds after she finished. He was not the kind of man who spoke into silence, because silence made him uncomfortable, which was a quality she had respected the one time she had been in the same formal setting as him before today. He was processing. She let him process. His adjutant leaned forward slightly to say something, and Adrian moved one hand, fractionally, and the adjutant settled back. She turned her horse and rode back toward the tree line, and she did not look back until the first trees were around her, and when she looked back, Adrian was already moving through his formation, with the particular efficiency of a man who had made a decision and was acting on it. She wrote the letter to her father that morning, short, factual, in her best formal hand with the seal she had carried since she was 15. She said she was well. She said her presence was her own choice and was not subject to dispute. She said formal diplomatic discussions were underway. She gave the letter to Owen, who carried it to the tree line, where Adrian received it with the visible expression of a man filing an experience that would take some time to fully process. She wrote the letter in the back tent that Adrian had his adjutant provide, at a camp table with proper ink, and she wrote it in the formal hand she had been training since she was 8 years old. She said she was unharmed and free, and conducting diplomatic work of direct benefit to the kingdom. She said formal discussions were underway that required the agricultural compound documentation to proceed. She said she expected the documentation to be provided. She did not ask. She stated. She folded it and sealed it with the small personal seal she had carried in her coat pocket since before she left the palace, a habit from the 2 years she had been secretly convinced she would need it at some point, without knowing when. That night the moon came full. The 14th night since the new moon when she had walked out of the palace, and she had counted every one. Full moon in Ashhold was a different thing from full moon anywhere else she had been. The charge in the settlement's air had been building since the afternoon, in a way that was hard to describe, except as a kind of heightening, as if everything that was always present in the pack was present in a sharper form, a string tuned more precisely. She walked to the northern edge of the settlement after the evening meal, to the boundary where the buildings gave way to the open margin, and then to the Ashwood. Cale was there. Cale was there. He was in wolf form, standing at the exact edge, where the settlement's open ground met the first trees. The full moonlight came down between the canopy gaps, and made everything in it silver and clear and old-looking. the way certain kinds of light made everything look older than it was. His dark coat took the moonlight in rather than reflecting it. His gold eyes found her immediately when she came toward him. She had worked hard today. She had done something real that moved the situation forward in a way that had been impossible 12 days ago. She crossed the open margin toward him in the moonlight, and something in the night air was very still around both of them. She placed her hand on his back. The fur was thick and dense and warm in the cold of the night, and it moved when he breathed. He did not move otherwise. She swung herself up. It was not graceful. This was not something she had ever done, and she worked through it with commitment rather than ease, finding her knees and shifting her weight, and taking a moment to establish herself on a form that was nothing like a horse's back. He held still until she was settled, and then he moved. There was no transition, still to motion in an instant, and the motion immediately purposeful and fast, faster than she had expected. And they were in the trees, and the forest was going past on both sides in panels of dark and silver moonlight, and the cold air was sharp against her face. She leaned forward and kept her hands in the thick fur and gave up on direction entirely, because direction was not hers to manage here, and she let the speed and the dark and the silver light and the cold become the only things there were for a while. They ran for a very long time, long enough that she lost track of where in the ashwood they were and stopped trying to establish it. Long enough that her body found the rhythm of it and stopped bracing against it. Long enough that she thought about nothing, which was something she was almost never able to do. When they stopped, she did not know where they were, except deep in the forest, with the moon directly overhead, through a wide gap in the canopy, and the light in that gap came down in a column that made everything within it visible, as if it had been arranged for the purpose. She sat in the moonlight and breathed. "I am staying," she said. He was very still for a moment. The forest held its breath. "I know," he said. She had not said it for him. She had said it because the decision deserved to be said aloud, in the place that had prompted it. She was staying. She had made that decision, and it was the right decision, and the ashwood deserved to hear it stated plainly. They rode back through the silver dark. The forest opened as they went, as it always did, as if it had been expecting them both. The documents from the capital arrived on the 6th day. A rider in Eldenmore Grey came to the tree line in the afternoon with a sealed packet addressed to Her Royal Highness, which was the correct formal address, and had almost certainly been dictated by Adrian, rather than arising from anyone's genuine belief that she held that title in this context. The rider was young, barely 20, and he handed the packet over with an expression that suggested he had been told this was important, and had not been told much more than that. And he was making the most of maintaining composure about the large wolf-shaped shapes he could see at the tree line behind her. She thanked him and told him to tell the general she would be in contact within 48 hours, and she rode back into the ashwood with the packet under her arm. The documents were everything she had asked for: registration forms, composition specifications, implementation dates, acreage reports, annual expansion summaries. 16 years of the agricultural program's growth documented in the careful language of bureaucratic record-keeping, which was exactly the kind of language that was hardest to argue against because it had been produced without any intent to incriminate anyone and therefore carried no defensible bias. She worked through the night and finished the evidentiary document before dawn. She read it twice when she was done, checking it the way she checked everything she had built, for gaps in the logic, for places where an alternative explanation could be inserted, for anything that could be attacked by a council secretary looking for reasons to file it rather than act on it. She found nothing she could not close. The chain was complete. She brought it to Cale at breakfast. He read it at the table while she ate across from him, and the morning sounds of the settlement came through the walls. He read it the way she had learned he read everything, completely, without rushing, without expressing anything about his response until he had finished. When he put it down, he looked at her for a long moment with those gold eyes that she had, over 17 days, developed a partial ability to read. "Cora should see this," he said. "Of course," she said. "And we should invite Adrian into the settlement for the formal sessions," he said. "Not at the tree line. Here." She had not expected that. "That is a significant gesture," she said. "It is a necessary one," he said. "If we are going to make a real agreement, it needs to be made in a place that acknowledges what both sides are. A negotiation at the tree line is a negotiation at a border." A negotiation inside Ashhold is a negotiation between two parties who recognize that the other has an interior. She thought about that for a moment. Adrian will need authorization from my father to conduct formal sessions. He will need the explicit backing of the Crown to commit to anything meaningful. Send him back to get it, Cale said. Tell him what is in the document. Tell him to bring someone who can make commitments. He will come back as someone who can make commitments, she said. He is that kind of man. He will not leave and return without the authority to actually negotiate. She was right about that. The message she sent to Adrian produced a 2-day silence, and then a writer back with a letter in Adrian's own hand. Careful, formal, acknowledging the document she had summarized, and requesting 48 hours to send for the appropriate authorization. The authorization came faster than she had expected, which told her something about how seriously her father was taking this now. Not seriously enough to come himself, which she had not expected, but seriously enough to send word quickly. The formal sessions began 10 days after Seraphine came out of the tree line. Adrian came into Ashhold with 2 advisors and a scribe, and sat at the long table in the main hall across from Cale and Owen and Cora, with Seraphine at Cale's right hand, in the position that was not quite one thing or the other, neither Eldenmore's representative nor the Pax, which was exactly the position she needed to occupy. The first session established the basic framework. Both parties acknowledged the existence of a formal dispute. Both parties acknowledged willingness to address it through negotiation. Both parties agreed that a scribe from each side would maintain records. This took 4 hours and could have taken 2, but the hours were not wasted because they were hours in which the 2 sides were in the same room and had not yet started arguing, which was its own kind of foundation. The real work began on the second day. Seraphine had spent the 3 days before the formal sessions began, reviewing every piece of Eldenmore law and treaty history she had ever had access to, working from memory, and from a handful of documents Adrian had sent in response to specific requests she had made through the back channel. She had been thorough about this in a way that she suspected no one on either side had expected her to be, including Cale, who had watched her work across the previous 2 weeks, without fully understanding what she was building toward. On the second day of formal sessions, she produced the precedent. It was a border management agreement from 83 years ago, predating the collapse treaty, between Eldenmore's 3rd District and a neighboring sovereign body, whose status had been contested at the time. The agreement had used specific language to address the water rights along a shared river system, language that acknowledged use rights without requiring either party to formally recognize the other's sovereignty in absolute terms. The distinction was technical, but it was real, and it was the kind of distinction that made the difference between an agreement that could pass through Eldenmore's council and one that could not. Adrian looked at the document she set in front of him. "Where did you get this?" he said. "The Palace Library Archive," she said. Section 41, which is the section that has not been touched in approximately 15 years, based on the condition of the materials. I spent 4 months in that section before I left. He looked at her with the expression that had been evolving across 10 days of formal sessions, from disbelief to professional assessment, to something that was approaching the specific kind of worry that experienced people felt when they encountered someone they had underestimated. "This is the language we use," she said, "for the water rights component. It does not require Eldenmore to make a statement of formal recognition that the council would not pass. It requires only acknowledgement of existing use, which is a different and lower threshold." "The council will still push back," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you will point out that the alternative to this language is a continued unresolved dispute with a party that has been patient for 40 years and is running out of patience, and that the specific financial liability of the agricultural compound contamination, if it is ever formally brought before an international arbitration body, is considerably larger than the political cost of the language I am proposing." Adrian was quiet. "She is correct," said the advisor to his left, who had said nothing substantive in 10 days of sessions, and who said it in the tone of someone who had been thinking the same thing for several days, and had finally decided to say it. Adrian looked at the document for another moment. He picked up his pen and made a notation. That was how Adrian operated. He noted things when they had reached the threshold of actionable rather than theoretical. It was one of the things she had come to respect about him across the sessions. The treaty stalled, as it had been going to stall, on the question of the hunting ground boundaries. The Eldenmore position, which Adrian presented with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a message he had not composed, and whose author he could not protect, was that formal acknowledgement of hunting ground sovereignty created a precedent that would be applied to other territories, and that the council was not willing to establish that precedent through this agreement. Kale listened to this with the stillness he maintained in formal sessions, and said nothing for a long moment after. The hunting grounds in question, he said, have been used by this pack for 200 years. The documentation exists. We are not asking Eldenmore to create a right. We are asking them to acknowledge one that already exists in practice. The council understands the distinction in principle, Adrian said carefully. Then what the council is saying, Kale said, still very calm, is that the distinction does not matter to them. Adrian did not answer that directly, which was itself an answer. Seraphine watched the impasse settle over the table and thought about the specific shape of it. The hunting ground question was not actually about the hunting grounds. It was about what acknowledgement meant as a precedent. Eldenmore's council was afraid of the word sovereign because of what it implied about future claims, and they were expressing that fear by refusing the word when its practical meaning in this specific context was entirely limited. She could find a different word. She spent 3 evenings working on the language question. She went through precedent after precedent from the archive in her memory, looking for the construction that acknowledged what was real, without triggering what the council was afraid of. She found it in a coastal fishing agreement from 60 years ago that had been made between Eldenmore and an island community whose status was also contested. Territorial use rights in perpetuity, documented and binding, without the word sovereign appearing anywhere in the document. She brought it to the next session. Adrian read it twice. He made his notation. On the evenings when the formal sessions had ended and the Eldenmore delegation had returned to their camp at the tree line, Seraphine sat with Kale in the main hall, or at the west window, or wherever the evening found them, and they talked in the way they had been talking for weeks now, carefully, and then less carefully, and then, by the 4th week, with the particular ease of 2 people who had learned how the other thought and stopped performing for each other in the ways they had performed at the beginning. One evening, late in the 4th week, he told her about his mother. He told her in the matter-of-fact way he told her things that were not matter-of-fact, without emphasis, without the signal that he was telling her something important, in a tone that was the same as when he told her about the hunting ground survey data or the border river drainage patterns. She had learned that the matter-of-fact tone was not absence of feeling but a particular way of managing it, and she listened to it with full attention. His mother had been the alpha for the 7 years after his father died. She had been 41 years old during the plague season, and she had been among the first sick and among the last to recover, and what she recovered into was a body that could no longer shift. The silver damage had settled too deep into the shifting mechanism. She had lived for another 20 years, in the human form only, which was living, and she had been the alpha for the full 7 years she held the role, and she had done it well. She told me it was like losing a color, he said, not a specific color. Just that the world had one fewer dimension than it had had before, and she could see where the dimension had been, which was in some ways harder than if she had simply lost it without knowing it. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. What happened to her? She said. She died of age, he said, 12 years ago, 3 months after I took the alpha role. She had held on long enough to see the transition. He looked at the table. She told me the night before she died that she had been waiting to see it. A pause. She said it was enough. Seraphine sat with that. He said, eventually, you have been here for almost a month. I know less about you than you know about me. She thought about what was true and what was relevant. I am the second child, she said. My brother is heir. I exist in my father's court, in a capacity that is functionally decorative and actually observational. I have been observing it since I understood what it was. At 16, my father brought me to a council chamber to meet Lord Philip Crane, who was 38 at the time, who had recently buried his second wife, and who looked at me the way men look at property they are considering acquiring. My father explained afterward that it was a strong match, and that I would want for nothing. She said it with the flat precision she had developed for this particular fact. I noted, at 16, that wanting was not a concept anyone in the conversation had thought to ask me about. Kale said nothing for a moment. And at 19, he said. At 19, she said, my father told me the match with Lord Crane was to be formalized within the year, and I calculated, very carefully, what the route through the Ashwood looked like, and I started planning. He looked at her. You could have gone anywhere else. I could have, she said. I went where the pursuit wouldn't follow easily. She looked at her hands on the table. The snake was genuinely not part of the plan. Something moved in those gold eyes that was not quite a smile, but was near enough to one that the distance hardly mattered. She came back to Ashhold the evening before the first formal session, and she stood in the main hall, and she thought about what she was doing. She was acting as an advocate for the Lycantian pack, in negotiations with her father's kingdom. She was using knowledge of Eldenmore's legal frameworks to make the strongest possible case for the pack's position, which was also the position she believed was correct, which was also the position that happened to be well supported by the evidence. She had been circling around what to call this for several days, and she had come to the conclusion that there was not a precise word for it, and that the absence of a precise word was not an argument against doing it. The evidence was what it was. The legal framework said what they said. Her skill was in connecting those two things clearly enough that the connection could not be avoided. She thought the thing she was also doing, the thing underneath the advocacy work, was deciding who she was in a way that was more complete than she had been able to decide before. The palace had been building a version of her for 19 years that served the palace's purposes. She had been quietly building a different version in the margins. This was the first time she had had the space and the occasion to put the margin version forward as the primary one, and to discover that the primary version worked. She finished her tea and set the cup down and gathered her papers. The evening hour was late enough that the settlement would be moving toward its own end of day, and she had learned to read those rhythms well enough that she knew when to finish her work and when to keep going. Tonight was for finishing. Across the hall, at the far table, Gareth sat with two members of his faction. He was not looking at the conversation between Seraphine and the Alpha. He was looking at the fire. But he had the specific quality of a person who was not looking at something because they had made a decision not to, which was different from simply not looking. She noted it. She filed it. She went back to her tea and the quiet and the evening, and she did not say anything about it, because the time for saying something about Gareth was not yet, though she could feel it coming. The formal dinner was Cora's idea. Seraphine heard about it from Lydia first, which was how she heard about most things in Ashhold that had not yet been formally announced. Lydia moved through the settlement's social current like someone who had been doing it since childhood, which she had, and information surfaced from that current with the cheerful economy of someone who did not treat information as possessing a particular moral weight. Cora said the compound documents constitute meaningful progress and deserve formal acknowledgement, Lydia said, sitting on the edge of the work table, while Seraphine organized her notes. There will be a dinner tonight. The whole pack is invited. The Eldenmore delegation is invited. Cora used the word ceremonial, which she does not use lightly. No, Seraphine agreed, she does not. Lydia looked at her. Are you worried? Seraphine thought about it honestly, which she found she was doing more often since arriving in Ashhold, rather than giving the socially smooth answer. I am attentive, she said. A formal occasion, with this many people, and this much at stake, has more variables than a negotiation session. More things can happen that were not planned. She said it, and let it rest, and did not add the specific thing she had been watching for 3 days. Gareth's expression across the past week had taken on a quality she could not read with precision. Not anger, exactly. Not the hot kind. Something more like resolution, which was often more dangerous than anger, because anger passed, and resolution did not. She prepared carefully for the dinner, arranged her hair the way she had learned to arrange it without a maid, dressed in the best of the 3 changes of clothing she had brought in her saddlebag, which was not elaborate, but was formal enough to indicate she understood what the evening was. She appeared in the main hall when the candles were lit. The hall held perhaps 70 people. Every table was occupied. The whole pack, by the look of it, from Cora and the senior members at the head table, to the youngest at the back benches, and Adrian's delegation of 4 on the guest bench along the side wall, and the council, and Kale at the center of the head table. Seraphine took her place at Kale's right, in the way she had stopped thinking about carefully, and had simply begun to do. The way you stopped thinking about a decision, after enough time had passed, that the decision had simply become the fact. The servers moved through the hall with the organized ease of people who had done this before, and knew the order of it. Bread and oil first, then the communal dishes that the pack favored, arranged in the center of each table, rather than served individually, which she had found strange in her first week, and now found simply correct for the kind of eating that happened here. where the meal was also a gathering, and the sharing of food from common dishes was part of what the gathering meant. Wine poured. Cora rose to speak. Seraphine was listening to Cora. She was also, with the part of her attention she maintained for surveying any formal room she occupied, tracking the table, the cups, the movement of servers, the position of each council member, the angle of Adrian's attention, the particular quality of Gareth's stillness at the far end of the head table. The server reached Cale. Seraphine watched the cup placed in front of him, with the fraction of her attention that was on the table, and she registered the color, and she registered it again with more attention, and then all of her attention was on the cup. The color was wrong. Not wrong in any way that would read as wrong to someone not specifically looking. Not the wrong color entirely, not visually obvious from across a room. Just wrong at the edge, just slightly darker, where the liquid met the pewter of the cup, which was not a quality of this wine at normal concentration. She had had this wine at 3 previous pack meals, and she knew what it looked like. She let nothing show. She continued listening to Cora. She picked up her own cup and moved it in the natural way of someone settling in at a dinner table, which brought her hand briefly within a foot of Cale's cup. She caught it. Faint. Very faint. The compound had a smell that she recognized because she had spent weeks with the water records, because she had read the composition documentation in full, because she had learned what the settlement's water and beverages smelled like in their normal state. The smell from Cale's cup was not the wine. It was something added to the wine. She looked at the table. She looked at Gareth. He was watching Cora speak. He was not watching her. She had perhaps 4 seconds before Cale would naturally reach for his cup. She did not think about it. She had made every preparatory decision already, in the 30 seconds since she had noticed the color, which was how decisions worked when you were prepared, and when the information came suddenly and required immediate action. She reached across in front of herself in the way of someone reaching for the bread dish, and in that same motion her left hand wrapped around Cale's cup, and she set it in front of herself and left her cup in front of him, and she drew her hand back with the bread dish, and she tore a piece of bread, and she listened to Cora finish speaking. Cale was talking with Owen. He had not looked at the cup exchange. Seraphine set the bread down and breathed. The dinner continued. Cora's formal words gave way to Adrian's formal response, measured and careful, acknowledging progress in the specific language of a man trained to acknowledge progress without creating obligations beyond what the moment required. Seraphine said 2 sentences at the moment when her contribution was appropriate, and then she was quiet, and she ate, and she tracked the room, and she waited to understand what she was dealing with. She was dealing with silver compound dissolved in wine. She had drunk approximately 1/3 of a cup of it over the past 12 minutes. She was running through what she knew about the compound's behavior in human physiology, at concentrations intended for someone with considerably more body mass than she had, and she was also tracking her own physical state with the focused attention of someone who had decided to know what was happening to them before it became impossible to know anything. The burning started slowly. It was not like fire, not heat at the surface. It was interior, deep in the center of her chest, and it was the kind of burning that had a deliberateness to it, a patience, as if the compound understood that it had time. She ate one more bite of the communal dish in front of her. She drank water from her second cup. She put the water cup down. She was not going to be able to stay seated. She stood. The room registered her standing. She was aware of it, the attention that swung toward her, the pause in conversation at the nearest tables. She stood for 2 more seconds, and then the floor was not entirely reliable. She heard Cale's voice saying something, one word, her name, but she heard it through the particular distance that was beginning to open between her and the room, and then the floor met her and she was on it. She was aware of the hall's quality changing completely around her, the dinner becoming something else, the specific silence of people who have stopped what they were doing because a new thing has replaced it. She was aware of footsteps, and voices, and cups being set down, and benches scraping, and somewhere in all of it, the particular purposeful sound of iris moving, which she had learned to distinguish over the past 4 weeks. She kept her breathing regular. She had decided to keep her breathing regular, and she was keeping it. Iris's treatment was precise, and efficient, and deeply unpleasant. Silver compound antidote worked by accelerating the body's processing and expulsion of the compound beyond the body's natural rate, which produced, as a direct consequence, the physical experience of very active and rapid expulsion, and Seraphine experienced that actively and maintained her breathing throughout. She found that focusing on a single point on the ceiling of the hall helped, and she focused on it. Kale was at the edge of the space around her throughout. She was aware of him, in the way she was becoming aware of him in most rooms she occupied, a fact of the room's particular quality, present and steady, and she was glad he was there, and she did not say so. Iris found it in the way healers found things. She had been moving efficiently around Seraphine, checking and treating with the focused competence of someone for whom this was serious work rather than a spectacle, and her hands had pushed back the left sleeve of Seraphine's dress to take the pulse at the wrist, and she went still. Seraphine felt her go still. She knew why before she turned her head to look. The moon mark on the inside of her left wrist was visible to anyone standing where Iris was standing, pale and luminous against the skin, its curved shape unmistakable in the candle-lit hall. Iris looked up. She did not say anything to the hall. She said one word to the Alpha. Kale stepped forward. He looked at Iris's face, and then at Seraphine's wrist, and then he pulled back his own left sleeve, and held his wrist out, and said nothing. The hall was the kind of quiet that arrived not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of a collective attention so focused that it consumed the room. Both marks, identical, curved and pale, and the same in every detail on both wrists, which had been visible on her wrist since the second night of her arrival, and which she had managed and concealed, and quietly carried for the better part of a month. "What is everyone staring at?" Seraphine said from the floor. The question landed in the silence. "I mean that as a genuine inquiry," she continued, at the same even volume. "I am currently unable to see most of the room from this position, and I cannot tell what has produced the current quality of the silence." She heard something from Lydia's direction that was abruptly stopped. Cora came forward. She moved through the space that opened for her with the deliberate economy she brought to every movement, and she bent and looked at Seraphine's wrist with the careful attention of someone confirming something they had considered as a possibility, but had not been prepared to assert. Then she looked at Kale's wrist. She straightened. She addressed the hall. She told them about the moon mark in the plain, factual tone she used for everything that mattered. She told them what the old records said about it, that it had appeared twice in the full span of the pack's documented history, that both times it had appeared on two people, that both times those people had become the bonded pair who anchored the pack's next generation. She told them it was not a claim that either person had made. She told them it was the moon's own recognition, documented in the oldest records the pack held, and that it had been present on the Alpha's wrist since the night the princess arrived, and had been verified tonight on her wrist as well. She said it all in a very quiet room, and did not perform it as anything other than a statement of facts that were available in the written record. Most of the room received it in the way she had been watching people receive things in Ashhold for a month, with the specific quality of people hearing confirmation of something they had already been privately concluding. She saw it in faces across the tables, the settling that happened when an understanding you had been forming without permission to form it was publicly confirmed. She saw it in Lydia's face most clearly, because Lydia had never been particularly good at hiding anything she felt. Gareth's faction received it differently. 6 people at and around the end of the table, who had the tight, particular stillness of people who had made a decision before the information arrived, and were not going to allow the information to unmake it. She watched it move through their expressions in real time, not surprise, because she did not think any of them were surprised, but something more like a hardening of a position already held. Gareth stood. He looked at Kale. He looked at Seraphine on the floor. He looked at both wrists with the flat gaze she had been tracking all month, the gaze of a man who had been wronged and had stopped expecting repair and had shifted into something quieter and more sustained. Then he left. 3 people rose from their places and followed him. The door at the side of the hall opened and closed, and the hall absorbed their departure in silence. Seraphine looked at the ceiling. "The ceiling of this hall is an interesting structural choice," she said, into the quiet. "I would not have expected exposed timber framing this far into the ashwood, given the availability of local materials." Several people laughed. They needed to laugh. She had noticed people often needed that after a difficult silence, and that saying something genuinely ridiculous was one of the more reliable ways to provide it. Kale sat down on the floor beside her. Not at the table, not at the room's edge, not in any of the positions the room's social architecture had available to him. He sat on the floor of the main hall, beside her, and he did not appear to find this remarkable, or to require anyone else to find it remarkable either. Iris came back. She finished what she needed to finish. She looked at Seraphine with the direct professional assessment of a healer, determining whether a patient was stable, and concluded, apparently, that she was. She also looked at Seraphine with something beyond the professional assessment that Seraphine catalogued and appreciated, without responding to it, because responding to it was a project for a different evening. The hall slowly redistributed itself back into something closer to normal. People ate again, or tried to eat again, or stood in quiet pairs and spoke at low volume. Adrian's delegation remained on their bench, and said nothing, and Adrian himself looked at Seraphine with an expression she could not quite read, but which had moved considerably from where it had been at the beginning of the evening. "The silver compound was in your wine," she said to Cale, when the room had settled enough that their conversation was private in the middle of it. "I know," he said. "I noticed it before the dinner started," she said. "The color was wrong, and the smell was wrong. I had perhaps 4 seconds to decide what to do." He was quiet. "You could have told me," he said. "If I had signaled you, whoever had done it would have known I knew," she said. "I did not know yet what they would do in response. Switching the cups was faster and cleaner." He was quiet again, with the kind of quiet that had a direction to it. "I am aware," she said, before he could say what the quiet was moving toward, "that the most available alternative to switching the cups was telling you, and allowing you to handle it. I made the other choice. I am not going to pretend I think I made a wrong choice." "No," he said, after a moment. "You are not wrong." She looked at the ceiling. The treatment was finished, and she felt hollowed out and extremely still, and she was going to stay on the floor for a while. "You have been carrying the mark for a month," he said. "Since the second night," she said. "I thought it would be better to understand the context before I said anything about it. A month is a very long time to understand context." "The context," she said, "has been eventful." Cale looked at his wrist, and then at hers. She looked at the hall's ceiling, and breathed, and let the evening be what it was. Before dawn, when the candles had burned low and Iris had checked her a third time, and most of the hall had slowly emptied, she spoke in the very quiet that remained. "Cale," she said. "Not Alpha, not anything formal, just his name." He was awake. He had not moved. "Thank you," she said, "for staying on the floor." A pause. "Sleep," he said. She did. Owen found her on the morning of the third day after the dinner. She was in the courtyard between the storage buildings with her knife, working through the sequences Brennan had taught her. The morning was cold and sharp, with early autumn, and her breath made small clouds, and she had been out here for an hour before the rest of the settlement woke. She had gone there before breakfast because her body had recovered from the silver compound enough that stillness felt wrong, and movement felt like the better option, and also because moving through the practice sequences did something specific to her thoughts that sitting alone with them did not. She was on the 7th sequence when Owen appeared at the courtyard entrance. He stood in the way of someone who had something to say, and was deciding how to say it, which was a quality she had learned to read on him across 5 weeks of watching him make decisions. Owen decided things quickly and efficiently. When he paused, it was because the thing he was deciding involved someone else's reaction. She put the knife away and followed him inside. He told her in the main workroom with the door pulled closed, standing at the center of the room rather than sitting, which was another thing she had noted about Owen. He delivered difficult information standing, as if he owed the person receiving it that particular seriousness. Gareth had been in contact with a man named Roland. She said the name back to herself silently, checking it against everything she knew. Lord General Roland, Military Council, one of the 3 senior strategic advisors to the Crown, a position he had held for 11 years, and had, in the past 4, been using to build a coalition of lords who were uncertain about the current direction of the kingdom. She had watched him in council briefings since she was 15. She had watched him in the specific way she watched anything that was moving faster than its surface suggested, and she had thought for 2 years that he was moving faster than most people in her father's government had noticed. She had not known he was this far along. Owen had found correspondence. He had found it because a younger man in Gareth's faction had brought it to him the previous night, a man who had been in Gareth's circle without being at its center, and who had, apparently, arrived at his own conclusions about the letters when he saw their content. 3 letters in a cipher that was not sophisticated enough to be entirely private when examined by someone willing to sit with it and work through it systematically. Owen had sat with it through the night. He had worked through it. He told her what it said. Roland had moved 8 days ago. He had used the period of the court's divided attention carefully and well, while King Edmund's focus had been directed north at the border situation, the deployment of 500 soldiers, the uncertain status of his daughter. Roland had been finalizing the consolidations he had been building for 2 years. The lords who had been drifting toward him had received private communications. The palace guard's senior officer had received something as well, which was the piece that made the rest possible. Edmund had been removed from the palace alive. This was not charity. Roland was not a cruel man. She knew this from observation. He was a practical one, and a dead king created problems that a displaced king did not. Edmund was alive, in his country estate under a comfortable arrangement that would be easy to document as voluntary, while Roland managed the capital and presented the transition to the broader nobility as a health measure taken at the king's own request. Gareth's 3 letters to Roland had discussed Seraphine's role in the negotiations. The moon mark, the evidentiary document she had built, the treaty progress, what she understood about the agricultural compound and the water crisis, and what making it Eldenmore's official position would require. Roland had understood what he was reading, a princess who had stopped being retrievable and started being a problem. A completed treaty between Eldenmore and the Lycantian pack would remove the territorial pretext Roland needed for the military engagement he had been preparing to justify his consolidation. He needed that engagement. He needed her removed from the board before the treaty was signed. The ultimatum had arrived that morning, in writing, carried to the tree line by a rider in Roland's colors rather than Eldenmore's standard gray. Return the princess within 2 days, or he considered the pack's possession of her an act of war, warranting immediate military response. Owen told her all of it. She sat with it, in the way she sat with things that needed to be fully examined before she responded to them. "My father," she said. Alive, by everything in the letters. Roland's stated position is that the king is resting at his estate, which means Edmund's loyalists are scattered and uncertain, and Roland is framing this carefully enough that they have not yet found a clean way to oppose him publicly. She ran the implications forward. He has approximately 6 weeks before the framing starts to crack. He needs either a military success or a formalized peace with the pack in that window, one that he controls. Either works. The war pretext is the faster option. Owen looked at her. "You could leave. Roland needs you for legitimacy. He will not harm you. He will use me," she said. A princess who came home willingly is a different story than a princess who had to be retrieved. He needs the story. She looked at her hands on the table. Leaving gives him the story. I am not leaving. Owen held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. "Once," she said. "Take me to Kale." The working building was at the western edge of the settlement. Kale was there, but he was not working. He was standing at the window with his hands at his sides, and she had the impression that he had already heard something, not the specific content, but the shape of the day, which was often how he received information about his pack. She closed the door. She told him what Owen had told her, in order and without unnecessary emphasis. Edmund displaced, Roland in the capital, 3 letters from Gareth, the ultimatum's content, and her reading of its actual intent. When she was done, she said, "There is something else, something I have been carrying for a long time that you should have." He looked at her. "I have been attending formal military council briefings since I was 15, she said. 7 years of them. Every strategic framework presented for crown approval. I have a detailed memory. Roland's approach to military command has appeared in those briefings 12 times over 4 years. She looked at him directly, and she did not soften it or qualify it. He deploys in 3 columns. His center is always his strongest force. He leads from it personally, which means his best units are there, and he commits them early and hard, because his strategy depends on early momentum. His left flank is reliable. His right flank is systematically under-resourced, because he distrusts the Eastern Lord's cavalry, which means those units know they are under-resourced, which affects their commitment. She watched him listening. When his initial momentum succeeds, he is nearly unstoppable, she continued. When it fails or is slowed, he does not adapt his formation. He holds his original approach past the point where a different command would have adjusted, because he builds his strategy on the assumption that the early push will set the conditions for everything that follows. He has won 9 of 12 engagements on that pattern. He has lost 3, and all 3 losses followed the same shape. His center advanced further than his flanks could support. The flanks collapsed. He could not recover his formation in time. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because I could use it as leverage," she said. "Safe passage home. A guarantee. Terms for my departure in exchange for what I know, which is a reasonable thing to want in my position." She held his gaze. "I do not want that. I am telling you because I chose to be here, and that choice has meaning, or it does not." He was quiet for a long time. She waited. "You are staying," he said. "I am staying," she said. The council met within the hour. She sat at the table, and no one suggested she should not be there. She noted this, and filed it beside other things she had noted over the past 5 weeks, in the category of things that no longer needed to be examined, because they had simply become true. Owen brought Gareth in. Gareth walked into the room with the quality of someone who had decided not to apologize for his position, which was not a position Seraphine thought he owed an apology for, since she thought apologies were not the correct response to genuine disagreement. He stood at the end of the table and looked at Cale, and then at Owen, and then at her, with the flat, measured gaze she had been watching all month. "Humans choose their own kind," he said. "When it comes down to it, whatever they say before." "She gave us Roland's battle plan this morning," Owen said. "She gave it without asking for anything. She had already told Cale she is not leaving." Gareth looked at her. She returned his look with the evenness she had for things she had made her peace with. She did not think Gareth was wrong to have been afraid. She thought he had made a choice, based on that fear that she did not forgive, but the fear itself she understood. She did not say any of this, because this was not the moment for it, and because she did not think Gareth was in a state to hear it. He looked for something to say, and did not find it. "The mark," he said, finally. "It could be coincidence." "It could," Cora said. "It is not." Owen laid out what Gareth's confinement would mean. A room in the East Building, meals, company from whoever wished to visit, freedom within the settlement's perimeter, not punishment beyond removal from anything with consequence for the current situation. Cale nodded. Gareth was taken out. The door closed. She looked at the table for a moment, and thought about what it cost a person to choose fear over evidence, and decide it was worth it, and whether she was angry about it, and she found she was more tired than angry, and that the tired would pass. The settlement moved into war preparation, with the efficiency of a community that had never forgotten the possibility of needing to defend itself. She had seen this quality in the pack, across 5 weeks, the baseline readiness that was not anxiety, but competence, a community that knew how to do the things that needed doing, and did them without requiring much coordination, because the knowledge was already in their hands. She helped where she could help. She wrote a full strategic document from her memory of Roland's briefings, not just the overview she had given Cale, but the specific unit details, the timing observations, the terrain preferences, the way he used high ground and the way he did not use river crossings. Every particular she had gathered in 7 years of attending formal council sessions. She gave it to Owen, and he read it carefully, and set it with the pack's preparations. She trained with Brennan for longer sessions than they had managed before, extended sequences in the cold morning air that pushed past the point of controlled practice and into something closer to the actual thing. She sat with Iris through an afternoon and worked through casualty preparation, what the healer would need, where the treatment space should be, how to triage under conditions that did not allow time for careful assessment. Lydia sat with her on the second evening before Roland's deadline and told her about Elan, 19 years old, very keen, the one who had been first to help her carry wood in her initial days at the settlement. He wanted to be in the first line. She said Elan's name, and let it settle in the specific way that things settled when you knew there was nothing to do with them yet. She was fairly certain Roland was not going to wait for the deadline. A man who sent ultimatums as paperwork for decisions already made did not wait for their terms. She gave him 1 or 2 days off the deadline, coming before the settlement could finish its preparations, because controlling the timing was the most basic advantage available to an attacking force. She was going to be wrong about the timing by approximately 8 hours. She was going to be right about everything else. She walked the settlement perimeter that evening, alone, which was the kind of thing she had begun doing over the past weeks, when she needed to think without any particular destination for the thinking. The pack had largely stopped marking her movements, which was a form of trust she had come to value the way you valued practical things, not because of their symbolism, but because of what they allowed. The outer buildings of Ashhold in the evening light had the quality she had observed since her first days here and had not been able to reduce to a single word. Complete was the word she had offered Cale, and it remained the best one she had. The settlement had the feel of a thing that had been built and maintained and cared for and used for a long enough time that it had become fully itself, which was different from other places she had lived, that were always in the process of becoming something rather than already being it. She thought about her father and his country estate. She thought about what he was feeling. She knew him well enough to know that the weight of it would be primarily the embarrassment of having miscalculated Roland for as long as he had, because her father's pride sat in his judgment, and his judgment had failed him. She thought he would also be afraid for her, but in the way he was afraid for things he felt he had already lost some grip on, which was a specific quality of fear she had been producing in him for approximately 7 years. She thought about the letters Gareth had sent, and she thought about what the letters had said about her. She had not read them herself. Owen had described their content, and she had taken the description at face value, which was something she was able to do with Owen, because she had spent 5 weeks reading him, and he did not dramatize. What Gareth had written about her had apparently been accurate in its facts, and had framed those facts in a way that made her function, and her presence in the settlement legible as a threat to Roland, which meant Gareth had understood what she was doing, even while he had not accepted it. Understanding what someone was doing and accepting it were not the same thing. She found she could hold both of those things about Gareth at the same time, even though only one of them was comfortable. She came back inside when the light was fully gone, and she ate the evening meal, standing at the side of the main hall, and she went to her room, and she checked her knife, and the small kit she had assembled across the past 2 days of preparations, and she set them by the door, and she lay down on the bed. Sleep was not immediately available. She went through Roland's column structure in the dark of the room, working through it from every angle she had. If his right flank was genuinely undercommitted, the opportunity would emerge in the first 20 minutes of engagement, when the disparity in commitment between his center and his right would become visible in the movement of the lines. The question was whether the pack could take advantage of that disparity, without committing too many of their own people to what might be a secondary engagement, rather than the decisive one. She thought about this, until she had thought it through in sufficient detail, that she trusted herself to access it quickly tomorrow. Then she closed her eyes, and she told herself that thinking any further about it was not useful until she had more information about the actual conditions. She was asleep within 10 minutes. The watch's signal came well before the dawn light reached the horizon. The signal was 3 short sounds from the northern watch, and she was dressed and at the door before the third one finished. The settlement was already in motion. She had spent the past week wondering, in the quiet part of her thoughts that ran beneath the preparations, what it would look like when the moment arrived. Whether the efficiency of preparation would translate cleanly into response, or whether the arrival of the actual thing would produce some gap between what people were capable of and what they would do. She stopped wondering about that within 60 seconds of the signal. The settlement moved the way it prepared, completely, without noise that wasn't necessary, with the focused quality of a group of people who had been responding to threat together for long enough that the response lived in their habits rather than their deliberate thought. She laced her boots quickly and picked up her kit from beside the door and went out into the cold. The moon was still high. The air had the particular quality of pre-dawn cold that arrived after a period of overcast and before the day began to warm, very still and very clear, and in that clarity, she could see the whole northern edge of the settlement gathered and moving into position with the organized quiet of a deployment that had been planned and rehearsed. Cale was at the northern margin. He was in wolf form, which she had expected. He stood at the exact edge where the settlement's open ground met the first trees, and the moonlight came down through the canopy gaps and made the open margin silver, and the trees behind it very dark, and the assembled pack spread in both directions from him. 40 or so people in human form, and more in wolf form among the trees. Brennan's older group, positioning east. Iris and her healer station already established well back. She went to the stable and found her gray mare. She saddled her in the dark quickly, and the mare accepted this without a sound, which was what she had come to expect from the horse. She led her to the northern margin. Cale turned. His gold eyes found her immediately across the space between them. She had 43 days of looking into those eyes in various contexts, and she had learned something of their vocabulary. But what was in them at this moment was something she had not seen before, not the patience of the council meetings, or the careful attention of their evenings, but something older and more fully itself, the thing that was in him, that existed before language or decision. She met it directly. "I am coming," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of that older thing for a moment, that was the length of a complete decision being made. Then he lowered himself. Not all the way, not any gesture that was about deference to her specifically, but the particular adjustment that created access for someone to mount. And she knew what it meant, because he had done it exactly once before, on the full moon night, and she had not forgotten a single aspect of that night. She mounted. The gray mare went to the stable handler. The pack shifted around them as Cale moved, and she was on his back moving north through the corridor of trees toward the open ground, and the forest was going past on both sides in the pale pre-dawn, and her hands were in the thick fur, and she kept her weight steady, and she breathed. She had ridden him twice. Both times through moonlit forest, not toward anything, not away from anything, simply moving. This was different, and she felt the difference as a change in the quality of the movement itself, purposeful, in a way the moon runs had not been, directed, with the whole pack around them, a different kind of company than the dark and the silver light had been. She began to see them as the trees thinned. She had worked to prepare herself for this sight, and the preparation helped, but the actual seeing of it was still its own thing. Roland's 3 columns arrayed across the open ground beyond the tree line, perhaps 350 soldiers in total by her quick count, considerably fewer than the 500 Adrian had brought 6 weeks ago, and considerably better positioned for aggression than Adrian's force had been. The center column was closest to the tree line, and densest. The flanks spread wide, and even in the pre-dawn, even from this distance and in this light, the right flank showed the particular quality she had described, the spacing that said reluctant. "His right flank," she said, keeping her voice low and aimed at the direction of Cale's attention. She had learned in the 2 moon runs that speaking this way, close and directed, worked, whether she was being heard or whether the sound of her voice was itself a form of information she could not say, but it worked. The right cavalry is 40 yards further from the tree line than standard formation spacing. They are already not committing to the position. His center will advance hard first. He always leads from his center, and he will commit it fully early. She watched the formation. When the center moves, the right will not match the pace. That is where the opening will be. She felt him understand it, not in a way she could have articulated precisely. It was a matter of the body beneath her, the way his shoulders moved, and the weight shifted, and the decision traveled through him into the direction of the pack around them. He moved forward. The pack moved with him. She had read accounts of military engagements in the palace library. She had read them carefully because they were useful, and because the information in them was directly applicable to the kind of strategic thinking she had been cultivating for years. What was happening in the open ground outside the Ashwood had the quality of several simultaneous things, and did not have the clean narrative structure of the accounts, and she noted this without judging it, and adapted to the actual texture of the situation, rather than the texture she had prepared for. She talked, steady and low and continuous, because she had decided that talking was her function in this engagement, and she was going to perform it regardless of uncertainty about what was being received. She tracked the position of the 3 columns in real time, and translated what she saw into language, and put the language into the cold morning air, and trusted the decision she had made, to trust the alpha she was riding. Roland's center came forward exactly as she had predicted. Hard and confident, his strongest units at the point of it, the command formation visible behind the advance as it pushed toward the tree line. The pack's response was controlled, not the full force, not a commitment that left the flanks unmanaged, but a meeting of the center that slowed it without surrendering to it. She felt Cale directing rather than engaging personally, holding his position and managing the shape of the response, rather than being in the middle of the contact, which was the right decision, and she was glad of it. "His right is still back," she said. "The gap is opening, his center is 60 yards forward, and his right flank has not moved." She watched Brennan's group on the eastern edge of the pack's line. They were waiting with the patience of people who knew they were waiting for a specific signal. "The gap is there," she said. Something moved through the pack, a communication, in a form she could not follow with her human perception, but whose effect was immediately visible. Brennan's group moved. They did not move toward the right flank directly. They moved into the space between the right flank and the center, the space that Roland's formation assumed would be covered by coordinated movement between his columns, the space that was not covered because the right flank had not moved and the center had come so far forward. The right flank recognized what was behind it before Brennan's group had fully moved through the gap, and the recognition caused exactly what she had expected it to cause. The right cavalry turned to address the threat behind them, which turned them away from the center, which widened the gap, which meant they were no longer providing the coverage the center assumed they were providing. Roland's center was now extended well into the engagement, with its right support gone, and its left support stretched by the width of the collapse. She watched this, and she watched the center, and she talked through what she saw, and she did not look away from any of it. She did not look away. She had made this decision before the night arrived, and she kept it through everything the night showed her, which was the actual texture of the thing that the accounts had described in narrative terms, and which turned out to be something that narrative terms were not adequate for. She looked at everything, and she kept her voice steady, and she tracked the shape of the engagement from the vantage of Cale's back, as it changed, and she called what she saw. It was in the center fighting, during the period when the center contact was hardest and most sustained, that she saw the moment she had known could happen, but had not let herself dwell on in the days before. She saw Elan in the first line, 19 years old, the boy who had been first with the wood at dawn during her first week, the one Lydia had mentioned with the specific quality of someone mentioning something they could not do anything about. She saw him in the fighting, and she kept her voice steady, and she tracked the shape of the engagement, and she talked through it. When the engagement broke, it broke completely. The decision moved through Roland's remaining formation, with the speed of a decision that has been waiting for permission, and then some units were lowering their arms, and some were moving away from the field, and the ones moving away were not being pursued. She did not think Cale had given that order specifically. She thought it was the order that came from understanding what the purpose of the engagement had been, and what it was not. They brought Roland to her. He had been in his center formation, where she had known he would be, and he had remained there through the full collapse of his right and left, which told her something about what he was beyond the politics. He was injured in the left arm, and he was composed, which was not composed as a performance, but composed as a genuine quality of the man. And he looked at her, and at Cale standing beside her, and at the tree line at her back, and said nothing. She had decided what to say and had changed it 11 times, and had arrived at something very short. "Tell the lords my father is restored," she said. "Not by force, by consent. Make sure they understand which word is which." He looked at her for a moment. He nodded once, which told her he understood the specific distinction she had drawn, and he was taken by 2 pack members toward the eastern edge of the field. Iris found Elan in the center field. Seraphine learned this later, from Lydia, in the quiet that came after the engagement, when the settlement was doing the things that came after. Iris had been efficient and controlled at the healer's station through the full period of the fighting, and when the fighting stopped, she had gone out into the field, with her kit and her 2 assistants, and she had worked through the casualties, with the precise competence that was Iris's fundamental quality in every situation. 3 people seriously injured. 4 with wounds that would heal with proper care, 1 dead. Elan was 22 hours past 19 years old. He had been in the first line, which was what he had wanted, and the first line had been in the middle of the hardest contact of the engagement, which was the center fighting that ran through the sustained period before Roland's formation collapsed. Iris brought him back to the settlement herself, which was not the most efficient way to transport him, but was what she did. Seraphine sat with Lydia in the main hall that evening, while the settlement moved through its version of the hours after. She sat with Lydia, and she did not say anything for a long time, and Lydia did not say anything either, which was a quality of Lydia's she had come to value specifically. The ability to simply be present in silence, without requiring the silence to mean anything in particular, or to be filled. "He knew what the first line was," Lydia said, eventually. "Yes," Seraphine said. "He wanted to be in it." "Yes." They sat with that. She had been thinking about the nature of the choices that led to first lines. She had been thinking about it since she saw him in the engagement, and she was still thinking about it now, in the evening hall, while the settlement moved around them. The choice to be in a first line was a genuine choice, made by a genuine person, who had access to the information about what a first line was, which was exactly what Lydia had said. She did not know if that made it easier to sit with. She thought it might be the kind of thing that was easier to sit with years from now than it was on the night after, and she was on the night after. She told Cale that she needed to see Alon before anything formal happened. He took her there himself, to the east building where Iris had prepared what needed to be prepared, and she stood in the doorway of the small room with the candle in it, and she looked at the 19-year-old who had been the first person in the settlement to help her carry firewood, and she stayed there for a moment, that was long enough to be honest. Then she thanked Cale for bringing her, and she walked back through the settlement in the night air. She did not want to be comforted, and no one offered it, which was one of the things she had come to understand about living among this pack. They did not offer comfort as a default. They offered presence, or silence, or work, and they let the person receiving those things decide what they needed from them. She had found this unusual when she arrived, and she found it correct now. She stood at the tree line. The open ground in the morning light that was now arriving properly, the sun's edge visible through the eastern tree line, looked like what it was, a place where something had happened. She was aware of Cale standing at her right, and of the blood on her hands, that was not her own, and of the cold, clean morning air. She thought about the palace at dawn, the light through the gallery windows when she sat in the formal gallery above the council chamber, the specific smell of the palace library in winter, which was stone and old paper, and something she had never been able to name. She thought about who she had been in those spaces, the girl who kept careful mental records of everything she heard in briefings her father did not know she attended, the girl who spent 4 months in the part of the archive nobody had touched in 15 years, because she had decided it would be useful. She thought she remembered that girl clearly and completely. She thought the person who had just stood on Cale's back in an open field before dawn, and talked a military engagement into a result she had been planning for 3 days, and looked at everything the engagement showed her without looking away, was the same person in every way that mattered. She thought she was also someone different in every practical way that had accumulated across 43 days of living a life that was not the one the palace had been building. She turned and walked into the trees. The forest was very still in the morning. The light came through the canopy in the long angled shafts that came at this hour, and only at this hour, and she walked through them, and they moved across her in the way light moved through a forest, and she felt the settlement ahead of her through the trees, in the way she had been feeling it for weeks. The specific quality of knowing where you were going, because you knew where you were going. She went in. 12 days after the engagement on the open ground outside the Ashwood, a formal Eldenmore delegation arrived at the northern tree line. She knew they were coming before Owen told her. She had known for 3 days, from the information that had been coming in through the channels that existed now, between the Pax network and the border traders and the soldiers who had stayed as observers near the tree line since Roland's formation was disbanded. Her father had been restored to the palace 9 days ago, which was faster than she had calculated, and the speed of it had told her something about how completely Roland's plan had depended on Seraphine's legitimacy. When that legitimacy remained in the Ashwood, it could not be used from the capital, and without it, Roland's coalition of wavering lords had found they were no longer wavering. She was glad her father was back. She was also already thinking about the negotiation that was coming, which was how she had always operated when there were 2 things happening at once. She let both of them be real at the same time, without requiring one to displace the other. Owen came to her at the west window workspace in the morning. He had the expression he used when he was delivering information that was large and manageable, rather than large and not manageable, which was a face he had gradually been using more often across the past 6 weeks. "Delegation at the tree line," he said. 20 members, standard formal formation. He paused. "The king is with them." She looked at him for a moment. "He came himself," she said. "He came himself," Owen said. She had not expected that. She had expected his council secretary, or his senior diplomatic officer, or perhaps Adrian, who had become by this point the most experienced person in Eldenmore's government, on the specific question of Seraphine Ashbourne, and what she was doing in the Ashwood. She had not expected her father to come personally, because her father did not make personal appearances at diplomatic meetings when he could send a representative, not because he was lazy, but because he had been advised for 30 years that kings who negotiated in person gave up leverage. He had come in person. She thought about what that meant for several minutes before she went to find Cale. They went to the tree line together, she and Cale and Cora and Owen, with Brennan and 2 others a respectful distance behind. She had dressed with care, not in the formal manner of the palace but in the manner of herself in this place, cleanly, with the practical quality she had adopted across the past 6 weeks, which was its own kind of formality, even if it was not the kind the palace would have recognized. The delegation was waiting at the tree line in the open ground beyond the first trees. 20 people, as Owen had said, in Eldenmore's standard formal arrangement, and at the center, not behind the formal arrangement but in it, in the place that indicated he was not observing but participating, her father. King Edmund of Eldenmore looked older than he had looked 47 days ago when she had last seen him, which she had expected. He also looked like a man who had been through something, and had come to terms with being the kind of man who could go through things and still stand on the other side of them with his spine straight and his expression under control. He had, she thought, always been that man. She was seeing a version of him that had recently had occasion to demonstrate it. He saw her, and he was very still for 1 second. Then he walked toward her. She walked toward him. They stopped at the appropriate formal distance. He looked at her fully, and she looked at him fully, and they were quiet for a moment. That was the length of a genuine look, rather than a formal assessment. "You are well," he said. "I am well," she said. He exhaled, just slightly, just enough to be visible. The formal session was conducted at the tree line, rather than inside Ashhold, which had been her suggestion. She had suggested it because the tree line was genuinely between the 2 parties, in a way that was true rather than symbolic, and because true locations had a different quality than symbolic ones in formal proceedings, and because she wanted the setting itself to carry honesty, rather than the particular kind of statement that came from one side hosting the other. She sat with Cale on one side of the line, and she sat across from her father and his council secretary, and Adrian, who was present, and who looked at her across the negotiating space, with the particular expression she had come to associate with his processed understanding of the situation, which was the expression of a very competent man who had encountered someone more capable than he had been prepared to encounter, and had adjusted his framework accordingly. Cora spoke first, on the pack's behalf, which was correct protocol, and which Seraphine had prepared her to navigate by walking her through every piece of Eldenmore formal diplomatic language she would be encountering. Her father's council secretary responded, and then Seraphine and the secretary did the work. The formal peace terms had 3 parts. The first was territorial sovereignty, Lycantian hunting grounds formally recognized, with the specific territorial language she had developed over the 3 weeks of negotiation sessions with Adrian, the language that had come from the 60-year-old coastal fishing agreement, and which was precise enough to be binding without triggering the Council's concerns about universal precedent. The second was the agricultural compound contamination, Eldenmore's acknowledgement of the cause and its formal commitment to remediation, with a timeline and specified responsible parties, in the form that the evidentiary document she had built made impossible to avoid. The third was the moon mark. The moon mark was the one that required a different kind of language than the other 2. Territorial rights and water remediation were matters of law and precedent and policy. The moon mark was something else, and the document needed to reflect what it actually was, rather than trying to frame it as something else, which was what a number of approaches to drafting it had attempted to do before she had set them aside and started from the actual fact. The formal language she had arrived at acknowledged the bond as an existing condition, documented and recognized by the Lycantian Pact's historical records, and established Seraphine as residing within Ashhold's territory by her own full and documented consent, and acknowledged the bond as a political alliance that carried the formal weight of a treaty of its own. It said what was true, in the specific language that made what was true binding. Her father signed it with his personal seal. Cale signed it with the pack mark that Cora had explained was the equivalent of a ruling seal. Seraphine signed it as a witness and party, which was a position that had no existing category in Eldenmore's formal documents, and which she had simply invented, since the situation required the position, and the position required a name. When the signing was done, her father looked at her. "Is this your choice?" he said, not performing the question, not giving her an opportunity to answer the expected answer, asking. "It is," she said. He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. You were always going to go somewhere we could not predict, he said, finally, in a tone she had not heard from him before, which was the tone of someone saying something that was an acknowledgement rather than a judgment. Probably, she agreed. I hope you will visit, he said, when you are able. She looked at Cale. I go where I choose, she said. You always did, her father said, very quietly, and there was something in that she filed for later, for the evening, or the day after, when she had time to sit with what it meant that he had always known, and had kept building arrangements that contradicted what he knew. The delegation stayed for the rest of the afternoon, and there was a formal meal at the tree line that the pack provided, and that was managed with the considerable hospitality that was the settlement's actual default once the territorial questions were no longer uncertain. She sat between Cale and her father, and she watched them speak to each other, very carefully at first and then with slightly less care, about things that were not the treaty, about the Ashwood and its particular character, and what the hunting ground territories covered, and how the pack maintained them. Her father asked genuine questions and Cale answered them directly, and she did not have to manage the conversation from either side, which was precisely what she had hoped for, without being certain it was achievable. When the delegation departed in the late afternoon, her father looked at her one more time. Be well, he said. You also, she said. She watched the delegation move away, across the open ground, and she stood at the tree line until they were no longer visible, and then she turned and walked back into the Ashwood. She found Lydia in the main hall when she came in from the tree line. Lydia had the expression she used when she was deciding whether to say something she had already decided to say, and Seraphine sat down across from her and waited. He seemed surprised, Lydia said. Your father. By what specifically? Seraphine said. Lydia thought about this. By you, she said. Not by the treaty, or the pack, or any of the formal things. By you. She looked at the table, and then back up, like he was seeing something he had been told about, but had not believed. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father at the tree line, asking his genuine questions and receiving genuine answers, and the particular look on his face when Cale spoke to him directly about the Ashwood's eastern range. She thought it was possible that she was not the only one who had come to the Ashwood and found something they had not expected. He will write to me, she said. He is that kind of man. He will write formal letters, and they will be carefully composed, and they will have an undertone of things he did not say in person. And you will write back, Lydia said. And I will write back, she said. Yes. That is something, Lydia said, in the tone of someone who had decided it was enough. She spent the 3 days before the full moon doing what she had been doing for 7 weeks, which was living in the settlement and working on the things that needed working on, and moving through the daily rhythms of Ashhold in the way she had been moving through them. She helped with Iris's follow-up work on the injuries from the engagement, which was still ongoing for 2 of the 3 seriously hurt. She continued her morning practice with Brennan, who had begun teaching her something beyond the basic blade sequences, something more fluid and less formal, that was harder to name. She sat with Cora for an afternoon, and Cora told her things about the pack's history that were not in any of the records, the things that lived in oral transmission, because they needed the voice of a person who had been there to carry them correctly. She thought about Elan. She thought about him in the mornings, when she went to the courtyard, and she thought about him in the evenings, when the hall filled. She thought about him in the way she had come to think about difficult things, not pushing the thought away when it came, but not feeding it when it came either. Letting it arrive and be present and pass in its own time, which she was learning was different from suppressing it, and also different from dwelling in it. She thought that this was one of the things she had learned in Ashhold that she had not expected to learn, how to hold loss with the hands that were also holding everything else. 3 nights later the moon came full. Cora conducted the bond ceremony in the open circle at the settlement's northern edge, under the full moonlight that came down through the canopy gap and made the space luminous. The whole pack was assembled. She had not known, until she stood in front of them, how much she had come to know each of their faces. She had been in Ashhold for 52 days, and across 52 days of communal meals and morning courtyards, and negotiation sessions and evening halls, she had accumulated a knowledge of faces that she had not been tracking deliberately, but had accumulated anyway, because that was how she was built. Cora spoke the old words that she had heard briefly described but had not heard in full before. the formal language of the pack bond that had been preserved in the records Cora had cited during the Moonmark explanation. The words were shorter than she had expected and more specific, and they were spoken without ceremony, in the sense of performance. They carried weight, simply from being what they were, the oldest thing the pack said in the most significant context the pack had, and the weight came from that, rather than from anything added to it. Cale stood across from her. He looked at her with the gold eyes that she had been learning to read for 52 days, and that she would continue learning to read for considerably longer than that, she suspected, because the vocabulary was deeper than 52 days had fully covered. He said his part of the formal words, which were 6 words that Cora had prepared him to say, and which he said without performance, the same way he said everything that was true. My equal, my bond, my queen. She looked at him. I want the record to note, she said, in the carrying voice she used when she was speaking to a room, which the assembled pack entirely was, that I entered these lands without authorization, restructured the foreign policy of a sovereign territory without being asked to, and consumed a cup of wine that was not mine, and that all of this is now formally recognized by 2 kingdoms. The pack was very quiet. Cale made the sound that was not quite a growl, and not quite the sound from the first night in the Ashwood, and was something she had come to understand as its own specific thing, warm, and contained, and directed entirely at her. The howl started from somewhere near the back, a young voice that was immediately joined by others, and within seconds, the sound filled the open circle, and then the night above the settlement, and then the whole of the Ashwood, as far in every direction as the forest ran, all the wolves and all the people together, the single sound of the pack in full voice, under the full moon. She stood in the center of it. The sound came from all directions and from the trees and from the sky, and from the moonlit ground under her feet, and she stood in it, and she let it be everything it was. At dawn, she and Cale stood at the northern tree line together, side by side, the forest at their backs, the open ground ahead where the light was coming in, across the flat land with the slow certainty of morning. She looked at the boundary between the forest and the world beyond it, which was not the edge of anything anymore but simply a place she stood. The Ashwood was quiet at this hour. The settlement behind her was quiet. The world ahead was also quiet, in the way the world was quiet at the exact moment before the day properly began. She turned to look back into the forest. The trees were close and old and entirely themselves, unchanged by anything that had happened in the open ground beyond them. That was the specific quality of the Ashwood that she had been trying to name since her first morning here. It did not adapt itself to human events. It had its own duration, longer and more patient than anything that moved through it, and what it offered was not shelter in the sense of protection, but shelter in the sense of a place that continued to be itself, regardless of what you brought into it. She had brought quite a lot into it. It had continued to be itself. She stood in it, and breathed.